Imagine stepping back in time to America in the late 1800s. Forget the black and white photos you've seen. Picture it in vibrant, chaotic color. And what's the one thing you'd notice almost everywhere you looked? The saloon. They were on every street corner, in every town, every city. From the bustling avenues of New York to the dusty trails of the West. It wasn't just a place to get a drink. It was the social heart of the community. In many cities, there was a saloon for every 150 or 200 people. Think about that for a second. More saloons than churches, schools, or grocery stores combined. For men, this was their second home. It was the bank, the post office, the newsroom, and the employment agency all rolled into one. Deals were made over a glass of rye. Jobs were found over a pint of beer. And the day's gossip was exchanged with every round. The air was thick with smoke, the sound of laughter, clinking glasses, and the occasional raucous piano tune. But this wasn't just about socializing. Alcohol was woven into the very fabric of daily life. For the working man, a shot of whiskey wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity. It started the day, providing a jolt of energy for a grueling 12-hour shift in a factory or a mine. It was the lunchtime pick-me-up, often served right at the factory gates from a rolling cart. And at the end of the day, it was the reward, the thing that washed away the grime and exhaustion. They called it liquid courage for a reason. It helped numb the physical pain of hard labor and the mental strain of a life with few comforts. Even medicine was steeped in alcohol. Your doctor might prescribe a whiskey toddy for a cold or a medicinal brandy for a weak heart. Children were given whiskey for a toothache. Patent medicines, sold by the bottle and promising to cure everything from boldness to consumption, were often more than 40% alcohol. It was the all-purpose solution, the go-to remedy for ailments, both real and imagined. This wasn't just a working-class phenomenon. In the drawing rooms of the wealthy, cocktails were a sophisticated ritual. Businessmen lubricated negotiations with fine brandies, and socialites sipped imported wines at elaborate dinner parties. Alcohol marked every occasion, from a birth to a funeral. A wedding wasn't complete without a toast, and a wake wasn't proper without a bottle to share stories over. It was the great social connector, bridging gaps between strangers and strengthening bonds between friends. But let's be real, it was also a powerful escape. Life in the late 19th century was tough. It was a time of massive industrialization, waves of immigration, and sprawling, often unsanitary cities. People were pouring in from the countryside and from overseas, chasing a dream that was often just out of reach. They were disconnected from their families, their traditions, their roots. The saloon offered a sense of belonging. Inside those swinging doors, an Irish immigrant could find fellow countrymen. A German craftsman could speak his native tongue, and a lonely laborer could find a moment of camaraderie. For a few cents, a man could buy a beer and with it, a few hours of warmth, light, and company. He could forget the cramped tenement apartment, the dangerous factory floor, the endless struggle to make ends meet. Alcohol was the cheapest form of entertainment, the most accessible form of relief. It blurred the sharp edges of a harsh reality. It offered a temporary reprieve from anxiety, from poverty, from the sheer overwhelming loneliness of modern city life. So, when we look back at this era, it's easy to judge. It's easy to see the seeds of the problems that would lead to the Prohibition movement. But to truly understand it, we have to see it through their eyes. We have to see a nation in the throes of incredible change. A nation of people working harder than ever before, often for very little. In that world, the saloon wasn't just a bar. It was a shelter. And alcohol wasn't just a drink. It was a tool, a medicine, a comfort, and a crutch. It was the fuel that kept the gears of this new, industrial America turning, for better and for worse. This was a nation that loved to drink, because in many ways, it felt like it had to. This profound relationship with alcohol set the stage for one of the most dramatic social experiments in American history. The forces of reform were already gathering, fueled by what they saw as a crisis of morality and public health. The battle lines were being drawn between the weights and the dries, a conflict that would divide the country and change it forever. To understand the fight for prohibition, we first had to understand what they were fighting against. A culture so completely saturated in alcohol that it seemed impossible to imagine life without it. Thanks for watching. If you found this journey into the past interesting, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you do not miss the next chapter in our story. We'll be diving into the rise of the temperance movement and the passionate crusaders who declared war on the saloon. See you next time. Welcome back to our series. Last time, we talked about the saloon as the poor man's club, a place of community and escape. But as the 19th century wore on, a darker picture began to emerge. For every man finding camaraderie at the bar, there was often a family at home feeling the painful consequences. This is a story of the other side of the saloon doors. Imagine a world with very few safety nets. No widespread insurance, no unemployment benefits, no robust social services. Your job was your family's lifeline, and your weekly wage was all that stood between you and destitution. Now, imagine a significant chunk of that wage disappearing into the saloon keeper's cash register every single week. For countless families, this wasn't imagination. It was a devastating reality. The term they used back then was squandering wages. A man might work hard all week in a factory, a mine, or on the railroad, only to stop at the saloon on his way home on payday. He'd intend to have just 1 or 2 drinks with his workmates, but hours later, he'd stumble home with his pockets significantly lighter. The money meant for rent, for food, for shoes, for the children, was gone. This created a cycle of poverty that was incredibly difficult to escape. A mother would have to stretch pennies, buy food on credit from the local grocer, or send her children out to work at a young age just to make ends meet. The saloon, which offered a temporary escape for the man, became a permanent trap for his family. This financial strain was a massive source of tension in the home, and sadly, it often boiled over into violence. The link between heavy alcohol consumption and domestic violence became tragically clear. Women and children lived in fear, especially on pay nights. A father and husband who was kind and gentle when sober could become a completely different person after a night of heavy drinking. Newspapers of the era are filled with heartbreaking accounts of alcohol-fueled violence in the home. It wasn't just a private family matter. It was a public crisis that groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union would soon bring into the national spotlight. They didn't just see it as a moral failing. They saw it as a direct assault on the safety and sanctity of the family. The danger wasn't confined to the home either. Think about the workplaces of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Factories were filled with heavy, fast-moving machinery with few, if any, safety guards. Construction sites, mines, and railroads were inherently perilous environments. Operating this dangerous equipment required focus and a clear head. But the liquid lunch was common, and many workers would drink during their breaks or come to work still feeling the effects from the night before. The result was a horrifying number of workplace accidents. A moment's hesitation, a misjudgment of distance, a slowed reaction, all consequences of alcohol consumption could lead to a lost limb, a disabling injury, or even death. When a worker was injured or killed, there was often no workers' compensation. The family not only lost their primary breadwinner but was also suddenly burdened with medical bills. Some employers started to recognize this problem. They saw that alcohol was impacting their productivity and, more importantly, the safety of their workforce. This led some industrialists, like Henry Ford later on, to become surprising advocates for temperance. Not necessarily for moral reasons, but for purely economic and practical ones. A sober worker was a safe and productive worker. And then there was the impact on public spaces. Public drunkenness became a common sight in towns and cities across the country. Men would stumble out of saloons, get into fights, or simply pass out on the street. This was seen as a sign of social decay and a breakdown of public order. It made streets feel unsafe, especially for women and children. The town drunk became a stock character, but the reality was a widespread problem that local police forces were often ill-equipped to handle. The endless cycle of arrest, a night in the drunk tank, and release the next day, did little to solve the underlying issues of addiction and poverty. This growing catalog of social ills, poverty, domestic violence, workplace accidents, and public disorder all seemed to point back to one central institution, the saloon. It became the symbol for everything that was going wrong in society. Reformers, particularly women who were often the primary victims of alcohol-related problems but had no political voice, began to organize. They saw that asking men to drink responsibly wasn't working. They argued that the problem was the entire system that profited from addiction and left a trail of broken families and broken lives in its wake. The cheerful image of the saloon as a social hub was being replaced by a much darker one, a predator that preyed on the working class, enriched the brewers and saloon keepers, and left society to clean up the mess. It was this powerful, emotional, and very real narrative of suffering that would fuel the single-minded crusade to ban alcohol entirely. The forces of Prohibition were gathering, and they had a mountain of evidence on their side. The dark side of the saloon wasn't just a talking point. It was the lived experience of millions of Americans, and it would change the course of the nation's history. Thanks so much for watching. In the next chapter, we'll dive into the rise of the Anti-Saloon League and the powerful movement that would lead to the 18th Amendment. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss it. See you next time. Imagine America in the early 1800s. It's a young, bustling nation, full of promise, but also grappling with a serious problem. The average American was drinking nearly triple the amount of alcohol we consume today. We're not just talking about a beer after work. We're talking about a constant, daily intake of hard liquor whiskey, rum, and gin. From the farmer in his field to the statesman in his office, alcohol was everywhere. It was cheaper than milk, safer than water, and a central part of social life. But beneath this seemingly normal surface, a crisis was brewing. In homes across the country, families were being torn apart. Men would spend their wages at the tavern, leaving their wives and children without food or money. Domestic violence, fueled by drink, became a silent epidemic. Businesses suffered from unproductive, intoxicated workers. The dream of a virtuous, orderly republic seemed to be dissolving in a sea of alcohol. Out of this desperation, a powerful new social movement was born. The temperance movement. It didn't start with politicians or powerful elites. It started with concerned citizens, especially women and clergymen, who saw the devastation firsthand. One of the earliest and most influential voices was a minister from Connecticut named Lyman Beecher. In 1826, Beecher delivered a series of 6 powerful sermons that sent shockwaves through the nation. He didn't just condemn drunkenness. He attacked the very idea of moderate drinking. Beecher argued that alcohol was a poison, a gateway to ruin that inevitably led from a single glass to complete moral and physical decay. He painted vivid, terrifying pictures of the drunkard's path, losing his job, his family, his health, and ultimately, his soul. His words were printed and distributed widely, igniting a moral fervor. Inspired by figures like Beecher, the American Temperance Society was formed that same year. Its mission was simple but radical: to persuade people to pledge total abstinence from distilled spirits. This wasn't just about personal choice. It was a crusade to save the nation's soul. Local chapters sprang up in towns and villages everywhere. They held rallies, organized parades, and distributed pamphlets filled with heart-wrenching stories of alcohol's victims. One of their most effective tools was storytelling. They created a new kind of drama called the temperance tale. These were stories, plays, and songs that depicted the tragic downfall of a good man who takes that first fateful drink. The most famous of these was a play called The Drunkard, which showed a happy family destroyed by the father's descent into alcoholism, only to be saved at the last minute when he takes the pledge. These performances were incredibly popular, drawing huge crowds and moving audiences to tears. They made the dangers of alcohol personal and immediate. The movement also had a visual element. You've probably seen the famous print called The Drunkard's Progress. It essays a depiction of a man as journeyed from a casual glass with a friend to a destitute end, culminating in suicide. This image was hung in homes, schools, and public places, a constant, grim reminder of the stakes. It was a brilliant piece of propaganda, simplifying a complex social issue into a clear, moral choice between salvation and damnation. Women were the backbone of this early movement. While they couldn't vote or hold office, they wielded immense moral authority. They were seen as the guardians of the home and the family. Women organized prayer meetings, circulated petitions, and even engaged in direct action, marching on taverns and demanding they close. They framed temperance not as a political issue, but as a defense of their homes and children. For many women, it was their first taste of public activism, and it laid the groundwork for future movements, including the fight for suffrage. The early reformers believed they were fighting a holy war. They saw alcohol as a demonic force that was corrupting American society from the inside out. They believed that by eliminating drink, they could cure a host of other social ills: poverty, crime, and family breakdown. Their vision was of a sober, pious, and prosperous America, a true city upon a hill. This initial wave of the temperance movement was astonishingly successful. Within a decade, millions of Americans had signed the abstinence pledge. The per capita consumption of alcohol plummeted by more than half. The movement fundamentally changed how Americans thought about drinking. What was once a normal part of daily life was now stigmatized, viewed as a moral failing, and a social threat. However, this early phase, known as moral suasion, relied entirely on voluntary persuasion. And as the movement grew, a new, more radical idea began to take hold. What if persuasion wasn't enough? What if the only way to truly defeat the demon rum was to ban it completely? This shift from personal pledges to legal prohibition would set the stage for one of the most dramatic and controversial chapters in American history. The fight was far from over. It was just getting started. The seeds sown by these early reformers, the passionate sermons, the dramatic tales. The grassroots organizing would eventually grow into a political force powerful enough to amend the Constitution itself. The awakening had begun, and it would change the course of the nation forever. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe for the next chapter in our story. Welcome back to our series on Prohibition. Today, in Chapter 4, we're diving into the story of the women who became the powerful, unwavering soul of the temperance movement. We often picture Prohibition being pushed by stern-faced men in dark suits. But the real grassroots energy, the moral force that truly shook the nation, came from an army of determined women. They weren't just asking for change, they were demanding it. And they were willing to take their fight right to the enemy's doorstep. So, how did this all start? Picture the late 19th century. For many women, alcohol wasn't just a drink. It was the source of so much misery at home. They saw their husbands spend their wages at the saloon, leaving the family with nothing. They endured the violence and neglect that often came with heavy drinking. And in an era when women had few legal rights, no easy way to divorce, and were entirely dependent on their husbands, they felt trapped. The saloon wasn't just a bar. It was a symbol of everything that was wrong. A place that stole their husbands, their money, and their family's security. They couldn't vote. They couldn't pass laws. So what could they do? They decided to use the one power society granted them, their moral authority. They weaponized their role as protectors of the home and family. This wasn't just a political issue for them. It was a deeply personal, spiritual crusade. And that brings us to the Woman's Crusade of 1873 to 1874. It was like a prairie fire of activism. It started in Hillsboro, Ohio, when a speaker named Dr. D.L. Lewis challenged the women of the town. He told them that if they wanted the saloons closed, they should go and pray them shut. The next day, dozens of women, dressed in their Sunday best, marched out of the church, straight to the town's drugstores and saloons. They knelt on the cold, dirty sidewalks, right in front of the swinging doors, and they began to sing hymns and pray. Loudly. Imagine the scene. A saloon owner, used to a rough, all-male environment, suddenly finds his entrance blocked by a choir of the town's most respectable ladies. Customers trying to sneak in for a drink had to walk past their neighbors, their friends, wives, maybe even their own mothers, who were on their knees praying for their souls. It was uncomfortable, it was embarrassing, and it was incredibly effective. The sheer social pressure was immense. In Hillsboro, within days, many saloon keepers buckled and pledged to stop selling alcohol. This tactic exploded across the country. From Ohio to California, thousands of women joined these pray-ins. They would stand outside saloons for hours, sometimes in the rain and snow, reading scripture, singing hymns like Nearer, My God, to Thee, and appealing directly to the consciences of the men inside. They weren't violent, but their presence was a powerful form of nonviolent confrontation. They were making a public spectacle of a private problem. They were shaming the liquor trade into submission. This wasn't a riot. It was a revolution of righteousness. Of course, it wasn't always met with success. Some saloon keepers fought back, dousing the women with buckets of dirty water or blasting loud, offensive music to drown out their hymns. Some men mocked them, but the women persisted. Their bravery was astonishing. They were stepping out of the domestic sphere and into the public, political arena. in a way that was completely unprecedented. This initial burst of energy from the Women's Crusade needed a way to become a sustainable, organized force. And that's where the Women's Christian Temperance Union, or the WCTU, comes in. Founded in 1874, the WCTU took the passion of the Crusades and turned it into a political powerhouse. Its motto was "Do everything," and they meant it. Under the brilliant leadership of a woman named Frances Willard, who became president in 1879, the WCTU grew into the largest women's organization in the world. Willard was a genius organizer and a visionary. She understood that the fight against alcohol was connected to a whole host of other social issues. She called it her "do everything" policy. For her, protecting the home meant more than just closing saloons. It meant fighting for women's right to vote, so they could have a direct say in the laws that governed their lives. It meant advocating for labor reforms, prison reform, and public health initiatives. The WCTU became a training ground for a generation of female activists. Members learned how to organize meetings, give public speeches, lobby politicians, and run massive petition campaigns. They developed sophisticated propaganda, creating pamphlets, songs, and school lesson plans that taught children about the supposed dangers of alcohol. Remember those charts you might have seen in old textbooks, showing a healthy stomach versus a drunkard's stomach? That was classic WCTU. They were masters of public relations. Their symbol was a white ribbon, representing the purity of the home. Women would wear it proudly, a quiet but constant statement of their beliefs. They organized massive conventions, marching in parades with thousands of members, all dressed in white, creating a powerful visual spectacle. Their local chapters, called unions, were in nearly every town across America. These weren't just meeting places. They were centers of community action. The women of the WCTU would continue the tactics of the earlier Crusades, holding vigils outside saloons. But they did so much more. They would visit schools to give scientific temperance lectures. They would provide food and shelter for the families of alcoholics. They established water fountains in town squares, offering a free, clean alternative to beer or whiskey. It was a brilliant, holistic approach. They weren't just trying to tear down the saloon. They were trying to build a better community in its place. What's so fascinating is how the WCTU linked temperance to suffrage, the right to vote. Frances Willard argued that to protect their homes and children, women needed the home protection ballot. How else could they vote out the corrupt politicians who took money from the liquor lobby? How else could they pass laws to create a safer society? This was a radical idea for many at the time. The fight for temperance became a key gateway for hundreds of thousands of conservative, church-going women to join the fight for their own political rights. They might have been hesitant to demand the vote for themselves, but they would demand it to protect their families. The WCTU's influence was immense. They successfully lobbied for mandatory temperance education in public schools across the country. By the turn of the century, millions of American children were being taught that alcohol was a poison that destroyed the body and soul. This created a whole new generation that was primed to see prohibition not as a radical restriction of freedom, but as a common-sense, public health measure. So when we look at the road to the 18th Amendment, we can't overstate the role of these women. They were the foot soldiers and the generals of the temperance army. Through their prayers, their protests, their petitions, and their political organizing, they shifted public opinion. They took the fight out of the churches and put it onto the streets, into the schools, and into the halls of power. They turned the temperance movement from a fringe idea into a mainstream moral crusade that was impossible for the nation to ignore. They proved that even without the ballot, a determined and organized group of citizens could fundamentally change the course of American history. Thanks for watching. In our next chapter, we'll look at another key player in this fight: the incredibly effective and politically savvy Anti-Saloon League, the organization that would ultimately get the job done. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss it. See you next time. In our last chapter, we saw America simmering with a growing discontent towards alcohol. Moral outrage was high, but outrage alone doesn't change laws. To do that, you need organization, strategy, and a political machine. Enter the Anti-Saloon League. If you think of Prohibition as a great historical storm, the Anti-Saloon League was the force that gathered the clouds, directed the winds, and finally called down the lightning. Founded in Oberlin, Ohio, in 1893, the Anti-Saloon League was different from the temperance groups that came before it. It wasn't just about heartfelt speeches or prayer meetings. Its leaders, like the shrewd lawyer Wayne Wheeler, understood that power in America flowed through the ballot box. They called their method pressure politics, and it was brutally effective. Their slogan was simple and powerful: the church in action against the saloon. They weren't just a movement, they were a single-issue lobbying powerhouse, arguably the most successful in American history. So, how did they do it? The League's genius was in its structure. It operated like a modern corporation with a clear, hierarchical chain of command. At the top, a national headquarters set the strategy. Below that, state-level superintendents managed operations. And at the grassroots level, a vast network of Protestant ministers and churchgoers served as the League's army. On any given Sunday, thousands of pastors across the country would deliver coordinated anti-saloon sermons, often written or outlined by the League itself. They would paint vivid pictures of the saloon as the source of all society's ills: poverty, crime, domestic abuse, and political corruption. The message was clear and emotionally charged. To be a good Christian was to be against the saloon. After the sermon, the collection plate would be passed, not just for the church, but for the League. This grassroots fundraising was vital. It gave them a war chest that rivaled those of major political parties, allowing them to print millions of pamphlets, cartoons, and posters. They blanketed the country with propaganda. Images of grieving mothers, neglected children, and brutish, drunken fathers were everywhere. They didn't just argue, they made you feel the urgency. They presented a simple choice: a dry, prosperous, family-oriented America, or a wet, chaotic, and morally bankrupt one. But their real power lay in their political maneuvering. The League didn't form its own political party. Instead, it endorsed or condemned candidates from existing parties based on one thing and one thing only: their stance on alcohol. A politician could be perfect on every other issue, but if they were wet, the League would mobilize its forces to defeat them. They were masters of the political game. Wayne Wheeler, the League's general counsel, was the mastermind. He kept detailed files on politicians, knowing their weaknesses and their strengths. He would approach a candidate and say, essentially, "We have thousands of voters in your district. If you pledge to vote for our bills, we will tell them all to vote for you. If you refuse, we will tell them to vote for your opponent." This was an offer many couldn't refuse. They called it being Wheeler-ed. The League's strategy was to start small. They didn't immediately push for national prohibition. Instead, they focused on local option laws, allowing individual towns and counties to vote themselves dry. It was a brilliant, incremental approach. Each dry town was a victory, a stepping stone. It built momentum and created a growing map of dry territory that they could point to as evidence of their inevitable success. As more and more areas went dry, it became politically easier to argue for state-level prohibition. By 1913, their dry map was spreading like ink across a page. 9 states were completely dry, and large portions of others were as well. The League was also incredibly skilled at framing the debate. They successfully linked the saloon to un-American activities. When World War I broke out, this strategy went into overdrive. The big brewers often had German names like Pabst, Schlitz, and Anna. The League masterfully used wartime patriotism and anti-German sentiment to their advantage. They argued that grain used for making beer and whiskey should be used to feed American soldiers and our allies. Drinking was portrayed as a betrayal of the war effort. A popular slogan was, "Shall the many have food, or the few have drinked?" They even claimed that German-American brewers were a fifth column, trying to undermine the American war machine from within. It was a potent, if unfair, line of attack. This perfect storm of moral fervor, savvy political pressure, and wartime patriotism brought the League to the brink of its ultimate goal. They had convinced a critical mass of politicians that it was political suicide to oppose them. The Dries now controlled enough votes in Congress to make their dream a reality. They weren't just a collection of concerned citizens anymore. They were a political juggernaut that had outmaneuvered the powerful liquor lobby and bent the American political system to its will. The stage was now set for the final act. With the political machinery firmly in their control and the nation caught up in a wave of reformist zeal, the Anti-Saloon League pushed for a constitutional amendment. They had successfully turned the tide of public and political opinion transforming what was once a fringe moral crusade into an unstoppable legislative force. The power they had built, town by town, state by state, was about to culminate in the 18th Amendment, a law that would change the course of American history. In our next chapter, we'll examine the passage of the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act, the legal framework that officially ushered in the era of Prohibition. We'll see how the League's years of tireless work finally paid off, and how America officially went dry. Thanks for watching. And if you're finding this journey through history interesting, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you and miss the next part of our story. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our deep dive into the history of alcohol. In our last chapter, we saw the temperance movement gaining incredible momentum, turning from a moral crusade into a powerful political machine. But today, we're going to talk about the single biggest catalyst that pushed Prohibition over the finish line. World War I before the war. The idea of a nationwide ban on alcohol seemed ambitious, maybe even impossible, but by the time the armistice was signed, it was almost inevitable. How did the global conflict on the other side of the world completely reshape the debate about drinking here at home? Let's find out. When the United States officially entered World War I in April 1917, the entire country was mobilized. This wasn't just a war fought by soldiers on the front lines. It was a total war that demanded sacrifices from every single citizen. Factories retooled. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, and a powerful wave of patriotism swept the nation. Everything, and I mean everything, was viewed through the lens of the war effort. The central question became, does this help us win the war? And for the alcohol industry, this question would prove to be devastating. The Anti-Saloon League, which we've talked about before, was incredibly savvy. They were masters of political strategy and public relations. They immediately saw the war as the ultimate opportunity. They didn't just continue their old arguments about morality and social decay. Instead, they brilliantly reframed their entire message. Drinking wasn't just a sin anymore. It was now unpatriotic. Saloons weren't just dens of iniquity. They were a drain on national efficiency and a threat to the war effort. They wrapped their cause in the American flag, and in the hyper-patriotic atmosphere of 1917, that was an incredibly powerful move. Their first major line of attack was efficiency. The argument was simple and persuasive. We were sending millions of young men, our doughboys, to fight in the trenches of Europe. They needed to be in peak physical and mental condition. The Anti-Saloon League and other dry advocates argued that alcohol dulled the senses, slowed reaction times, and undermined the discipline of our soldiers. They printed posters showing a sober, clear-eyed American soldier next to a blurry, unfocused image of a drinker, asking which one you'd want defending your country. They claimed that cities with saloons near military training camps saw higher rates of misconduct and disease among recruits. Whether these claims were entirely accurate was almost beside the point. The message resonated deeply with a public anxious for victory. The idea that a soldier's effectiveness could be compromised by a beer was a powerful emotional argument. This argument extended beyond the military to the home front. The war effort required a massive industrial mobilization. Factories were churning out ships, planes, guns, and ammunition at a staggering rate. The Dries argued that workers who drank were less productive. They claimed Blue Mondays, the day after a weekend of heavy drinking, resulted in higher rates of absenteeism, more workplace accidents, and lower quality work. Think about it from the perspective of a factory manager trying to meet a government contract. An argument that banning alcohol would boost your factory's output and help win the war was very compelling. The slogan, "A sober man's a safe man," became a common refrain in industrial centers. Efficiency and patriotism were now two sides of the same coin, and alcohol was positioned as the enemy of both. The second, and perhaps even more powerful, argument was grain conservation. World War I created a massive food crisis. The farmlands of Europe were battlefields. Submarine warfare disrupted supply lines. Allied nations like Britain, France, and Italy were facing severe food shortages, and there was a real fear of widespread starvation. America, with its vast agricultural resources, was tasked with being the breadbasket for the Allies. Herbert Hoover, who would later become president, was appointed to lead the U.S. Food Administration. His job was to manage the nation's food supply, and his motto was, "Food will win the war." This set the stage for a public relations blitz promoting conservation. Americans were encouraged to observe meatless Mondays and wheatless Wednesdays. Families planted victory gardens in their backyards to grow their own vegetables. Every citizen was asked to do their part to save food for the troops and our allies. So, where did alcohol fit into this picture? Well, what is beer made from? What is whiskey made from? Grain. Lots and lots of grain. Suddenly, the production of alcoholic beverages looked like an outrageous waste of essential resources. The dry advocates pounced on this. They published statistics showing how many millions of bushels of barley, corn, and rye were being used by brewers and distillers each year. Then they translated those numbers into something everyone could understand. Sai. The grain used to make 1 pint of beer could make a loaf of bread to feed a starving child in Belgium. This was brilliant propaganda. It created a stark moral choice. Do you want your beer, or do you want to feed our soldiers and our allies? Do you support the saloon, or do you support the troops? In the context of a brutal war, that was an easy choice for most people. The slogan, "Shall the many have food or the few have drink," appeared on posters and in newspapers across the country. The visual of a fat brewer hoarding grain while soldiers starved was incredibly effective. This argument transformed temperance from a personal moral issue into a matter of urgent national survival. The third and final nail in the coffin for the alcohol industry was anti-German sentiment. When the U.S. entered the war, a massive wave of suspicion and hostility was directed at anything and anyone perceived as German. German-language newspapers were shut down. Sauerkraut was renamed Liberty Cabbage. People with German-sounding last names were harassed. And who dominated the American brewing industry? German Americans. Names like Pabst, Schlitz, Blatz, and Anheuser-Busch were synonymous with beer in America. These were families who had immigrated from Germany in the 19th century and built massive, successful businesses. For decades, they had been a respected part of American society. But overnight, their German heritage became a liability. The Anti-Saloon League and other dry propagandists exploited this xenophobia mercilessly. They painted the brewers as a disloyal German-American alliance. They spread rumors, often completely unfounded, that German-American brewers were funding the German war effort. They called saloons Kaiser-S recruiting stations and claimed that brewers were trying to undermine the American war effort from within by making our soldiers and workers drunk and inefficient. A famous propagandist named Wayne Wheeler, the head of the Anti-Saloon League, publicly declared that the German-American alliance speaks for German Americans, for beer, and for the Kaiser. This was an outrageous and unfair accusation, but it stuck. The brewers were caught in an impossible position. They were patriotic Americans, many of whom had sons fighting in the U.S. Army. They bought war bonds and publicly supported the war effort, but their German names and their industry's product made them an easy target. The campaign was vicious and effective, linking the consumption of beer directly with treason. To drink a Pabst or a Schlitz was, in the minds of many, to support the enemy. So you have this perfect storm. First, the patriotic argument. Sober soldiers and workers are more effective. Second, the conservation argument. Grain is for bread, not beer. And third, the xenophobic argument. The brewers are Germans, and therefore any one of these arguments would have been powerful on its own. Together, they were unstoppable. They allowed the dries to completely bypass the old debates about personal liberty. This was no longer about whether an individual had the right to drink. This was about winning the war. In 1917, Congress passed the Leva Food and Fuel Control Act. This law gave the president sweeping powers to regulate food and fuel for the war effort. One of its key provisions was a ban on the production of distilled spirits, like whiskey, for the duration of the war. Then, they limited the alcohol content of beer and the amount of grain that could be used to produce it. The noose was tightening. The war essentially created a temporary, de facto prohibition. And people got used to it. The dries could point to it and say, "See, the country is running just fine without liquor. In fact, it's running better." With the alcohol industry crippled by wartime regulations and public opinion firmly on their side, the Anti-Saloon League made its final move. While the nation was distracted by the war, they pushed for a constitutional amendment. They had been working for years at the state and local level, electing dry politicians to Congress. By 1917, they had the votes. The 18th Amendment, which would ban the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquor, passed both houses of Congress in December of that year. It was then sent to the states for ratification, fueled by the patriotic fervor of the war. State after state quickly approved it. By the time the war ended in November 1918, the momentum was irreversible. The arguments that had been so effective during the war, patriotism, conservation, anti-German sentiment, had done their job. They had convinced the American public and its politicians that a national ban on alcohol was a necessary and patriotic step. The war had changed everything. It took the temperance movement from the fringe to the very center of American political power and gave them the ultimate victory they had sought for nearly a century. Thanks for watching. Next time, we'll explore what happened when the 18th Amendment officially became law and the era of national prohibition began. It's a story of unintended consequences, gangsters, and secret speak. You won't want to miss it. Make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next chapter. Say, you 10. Have you ever wondered how an entire nation, a country practically built in taverns and pubs, decided to ban alcohol completely? It sounds almost unbelievable, right? Well, that's exactly what happened with the 18th Amendment. Let's dive into the story of how America went dry. The year is 1917. The world is engulfed in the Great War, and America has just joined the fight. Back home, another war has been raging for decades. The war against the saloon. Groups like the Anti-Saloon League and the Women's Christian Temperance Union, or WCTU, had been gaining incredible power. They weren't just a small group of teetotalers anymore. They had become one of the most effective and powerful political lobbying groups in American history. Their message was simple and powerful. Alcohol is the root of all evil. It destroys families, fuels crime, and corrupts politicians. They painted a vivid picture. Imagine your husband spending his entire paycheck at the saloon, leaving you and your children to starve. Imagine the political boss in a smoke-filled room, buying votes with free beer. This was the narrative they pushed, and it was incredibly effective. They were master storytellers and brilliant political strategists. The leader of the Anti-Saloon League, a man named Wayne Wheeler, developed a tactic he called Wheelerism. He didn't care if a politician was wet, someone who drank, or a teetotal. All he cared about was one thing. Would they vote the way he wanted? He would support anyone, regardless of their party or personal habits, as long as they promised to vote for prohibition. This single-issue focus allowed the League to build a massive bipartisan coalition in Congress. Now, add World War I to this mix. Patriotism was at an all-time high, and anything German was viewed with suspicion. And guess who owned many of the biggest breweries in America? German-American families like Busch, Pabst, and Miller. The Dries cleverly linked drinking beer to being unpaid. They argued that the grain used to make beer and whiskey should be used to feed our soldiers and our allies overseas. A popular slogan at the time was "Sober soldiers are the best soldiers." The war gave the Prohibition movement the perfect patriotic cover. They framed it not just as a moral issue, but as a matter of national security and winning the war. With this perfect storm of moral fervor, political pressure, and wartime patriotism, the stage was set. In December 1917, Congress was ready to act. The bill, known as the 18th Amendment, was brought to the floor. The debate was intense, but the outcome was almost a foregone conclusion. The Anti-Saloon League had done its job too well. They had the votes. Many congressmen who personally enjoyed a drink still voted for the amendment. Why? Because they were terrified of the political power of the dry lobby. They knew that if they voted against it, the League would pour money and resources into their opponent's campaign in the next election and brand them as unpatriotic and immoral. The House of Representatives voted 282 to 128 in favor of the amendment. The Senate followed, passing it with a vote of 65 to 20. The numbers were overwhelming. The amendment didn't just ban the sale of alcohol. It prohibited the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors within the United States. It was a sweeping, nationwide ban. But passing it through Congress was only the first step. For it to become part of the Constitution, it needed to be ratified, or approved, by 3/4 of the states. That's 36 states at the time. The Dries were confident. They had been working at the state level for years, getting dry politicians elected to state legislatures. The amendment included a 7-year deadline for ratification, but they wouldn't need it. The states began to ratify the amendment with incredible speed. It was like a domino effect. Mississippi was the first to ratify in January 1918. Other states in the South and West, where temperance sentiment was strongest, quickly followed. The opposition, led by the brewers and distillers, was disorganized and caught completely off guard. They never believed it would actually go this far. On January 16, 1919, just over a year after Congress passed it, Nebraska became the 36th state to ratify the 18th Amendment. It was official. The Constitution of the United States would now include a ban on alcohol. The law was set to go into effect 1 year later, on January 17, 1920. The Dries celebrated, they called it, a victory for God and morality. The prominent evangelist Billy Sunday held a mock funeral for John Barleycorn, a personification of alcohol, in front of a cheering crowd of 10,000 people. He declared, "The slums will soon be only a memory. We will turn our prisons into factories and our jails into storehouses and corn cribs." They truly believed they were on the verge of creating a perfect, sin-free society. A new era, which they called the Noble Experiment, was about to begin. They thought they had solved one of America's biggest problems, but as we'll see, they hadn't ended the consumption of alcohol. They had just driven it underground, creating a whole new set of problems that would define the roaring 20s problems like speakeasies, bootleggers, and the rise of organized crime. The birth of the 18th Amendment wasn't an end, but the beginning of one of the most fascinating and chaotic chapters in American history. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this story as interesting as I do, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. Let me know in the comments, what do you think was Prohibition, a good idea that just went wrong? I'd love to hear your thoughts. See you next time. Welcome back to our series on the 26th Amendment. In our last chapter, we saw Congress finally pass the amendment, sending it to the states for ratification. Today, in Chapter 8, we're diving into the final, breathtaking sprint to the finish line. The ratification process. This wasn't just a victory, it was a political phenomenon, a ratification that happened at a speed almost unheard of in American history. The stage was set for a dramatic conclusion to a decades-long fight. So, how did this happen so fast? Let's set the scene. On March 23, 1971, the 26th Amendment was officially proposed by Congress. The clock started ticking. For an amendment to become part of the Constitution, it needs to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. Back then, that meant 38 states had to say yes. The average time for an amendment to get ratified was around 1.5 years, with some taking several years. But the 26th Amendment was different. The groundwork had already been laid. The first states to ratify did so almost immediately. On the very same day Congress passed the amendment, March 23rd, 5 states jumped on board: Connecticut, Delaware, Minnesota, Tennessee, and Washington. Think about that. Within hours, legislatures were convening, voting, and sending their approval. This wasn't a coincidence. It was the result of a powerful, nationwide grassroots movement that had been building momentum for years. Activist groups, student organizations, and political leaders had been lobbying state legislatures long before the amendment even cleared Congress. They were ready. The energy was electric. News of the first 5 states spread like wildfire, creating a domino effect. States didn't want to be seen as being against youth rights, especially with the 1972 election cycle looming. Political pressure was immense. The slogan "old enough to fight, old enough to vote" was still ringing in everyone's ears. The Vietnam War was still a painful reality, and the moral argument for the amendment was simply undeniable for most Americans. Any politician opposing it risked looking out of touch and unfair. In the days that followed, the pace didn't slow down. By the end of March, just 8 days after it was proposed, a total of 18 states had ratified the amendment. States like Hawaii, Massachusetts, and Idaho were all part of this first wave. Each ratification was a media event, celebrated by young people across the country. It was a race, and every state wanted to be part of this historic moment. The National Education Association and other groups kept a running tally, publicizing each state's decision and urging others to act quickly. April and May of 1971 saw another surge of ratifications. States from every region of the country joined in. Maine, Arizona, and Nebraska all gave their approval. The speed was truly remarkable. This wasn't a partisan issue. Both Democratic and Republican-controlled legislatures were voting overwhelmingly in favor. The unity was a testament to how deeply the core idea of the amendment for young adults had penetrated the national consciousness. The Supreme Court's decision in Oregon v. Mitchell had created a logistical nightmare for election officials who were facing the prospect of running two different registration systems for federal and state elections. This practical problem gave states a huge incentive to ratify the amendment quickly to create a single, uniform voting age of 18 for all elections. By June, the finish line was in sight. The number of ratifying states climbed into the 30s. Everyone was watching, waiting to see which state would be the 38th, the one to push the amendment over the top and into the Constitution. The media was tracking the progress daily. Would it be a large state like Ohio or a smaller one? The anticipation was building. This wasn't just a legal process. It was a national drama playing out in real time. On June 30th, 1971, the magic number was reached. It was a dramatic day with 3 states ratifying one after another. North Carolina and Alabama both cast their votes of approval. Then, later that day, it was Ohio's turn. The Ohio legislature cast its vote, becoming the 38th state to ratify the 26th Amendment. Just like that, it was done. The fight was over. The voting age was officially lowered to 80 for all elections, federal, state, and local. The entire process, from congressional proposal to final ratification, took only 100 days. 2 days. It remains the fastest ratification of a constitutional amendment in U.S. history. This incredible speed wasn't just a historical footnote. It was a powerful statement. It showed a nation united behind a cause, a government responsive to the will of its people, and the immense power of a dedicated, passionate, and well-organized movement. The youth of America had demanded their rights, and the nation had listened. The official certification ceremony took place on July 5, 1971, at the White House. President Richard Nixon, surrounded by young members of the Young Americans in Concert Choir, signed the certificate that formally enshrined the 26th Amendment in the Constitution. In his remarks, he praised the energy and idealism of America's youth. It was a symbolic moment. The same young people who had been protesting and campaigning for their right to vote were now standing in the White House, witnessing their victory being written into the nation's founding document. This lightning-fast ratification was the culmination of everything we've talked about in this series. The moral clarity of the argument, the political pressure of the Vietnam War, the strategic legal battles, and the relentless energy of youth activists. It was a perfect storm that led to a historic and rapid change. The story of the 26th Amendment is a powerful reminder that when people come together for a just cause, they can move mountains, or in this case change the Constitution in record time. Join us for our final chapter, where we'll explore the legacy and impact of the 26th Amendment, and what it means for young voters today. The story isn't over yet. Thanks for watching, and if you're enjoying this series, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Welcome back to our series on Prohibition. Today, we're diving into Chapter 9, the Volstead Act, the law that put the 18th Amendment into action. Now, most people think Prohibition meant you couldn't even look at a bottle of booze without getting arrested. But the reality is way more complicated and, honestly, kind of bizarre. So, what did the Volstead Act actually outlaw? Let us get one major misconception out of the way right now. Drinking alcohol was never illegal. You heard that right. Owning it wasn't illegal either, as long as you had acquired it before Prohibition started on January 17, 1920. Imagine that. The government basically said, hey, we're banning alcohol, but also, if you already have a cellar full of the good stuff, you're fine. Enjoy. This created a frantic, last-minute buying spree just before the law took effect. Wealthy folks spent fortunes stocking up their private cellars, buying enough wine, whiskey, and spirits to last them for years, or even decades. The night before Prohibition began was nicknamed the last night on Earth. In so may seated, with parties raging until the final legal second. People were literally rolling barrels of whiskey down the street to get them home in time. It was a clear sign of what was to come. A law that applied very differently depending on how much money you had. If you were rich, prohibition was a minor inconvenience. If you were working class, it was a completely different story. You couldn't afford to stockpile, so your access to alcohol was cut off overnight. This fundamental inequality was baked into the law from the very beginning. So if drinking and owning weren't illegal, what was? The Volstead Act, officially known as the National Prohibition Act, targeted the commercial side of the industry. The three big no-nos were the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors. That's the core of it. You couldn't make it, you couldn't sell it, and you couldn't move it. The goal was to dry up the supply chain. The thinking was, if nobody can produce or distribute alcohol, then eventually, people will just stop drinking it. It sounds logical on paper, but human nature is a funny thing. When you tell people they can't have something, what's the first thing they want? Exactly. The law created a massive, nationwide void. And where there's a void, there's an opportunity. And boy, did people get creative. The act also had to define what intoxicating liquors actually meant. They set the threshold at 0.5% alcohol by volume, or 0.5%. Anything above that was illegal. This was a ridiculously low number. For context, most modern non-alcoholic beers contain around that much. Even some naturally fermented fruit juices, or improperly stored kombucha, could technically tip over that limit. This strict definition immediately criminalized beer and wine, which many people, even some supporters of temperance, didn't consider to be the real problem. They were targeting the hard stuff, the whiskey and gin. But the Anti-Saloon League, the powerhouse lobbying group behind Prohibition, insisted on this all-encompassing definition. They wanted a bone-dry nation, and they pushed hard to make sure the law left no room for interpretation. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Then, the Volstead Act was riddled with loopholes big enough to drive a beer truck through. It was like a giant piece of Swiss cheese. The most significant exception was for medicinal purposes. Soothingly. Everyone in America seemed to have a persistent ailment that could only be cured by a doctor's prescription for medicinal whiskey. Doctors could prescribe a pint of spirits every 10 days. Pharmacies, which had been in decline, saw a massive resurgence. Walgreens, for example, grew from about 20 stores to nearly 400 during the 1920s, largely thanks to their pharmacy counters, doling out medicinal booze. The number of patients needing a little something for their nerves, their digestion, or just a general sense of malaise skyrocketed. It became a running joke, but it was also a huge business. Then there was the exception for religious purposes. Sacramental wine was still perfectly legal for use in religious ceremonies. As you can imagine, congregations suddenly swelled, and there was a remarkable increase in the number of self-proclaimed rabbis and priests applying for licenses to acquire wine for their flocks. The demand for sacramental wine went through the roof. Records show that applications for this wine increased by hundreds of thousands of gallons. It was an obvious scam, but it was perfectly legal under the letter of the law. You could literally walk into a church and walk out with a bottle of wine, all under the guise of religious observation. And we can't forget the industrial alcohol exception. Alcohol is a key ingredient in countless industrial processes, from making perfume and antifreeze to solvents and fuels. The Volstead Act allowed for the continued production of this denatured alcohol. To stop people from drinking it, the government required companies to add toxic or foul-tasting chemicals to it, like methanol, gasoline, or iodine. The idea was to make it undrinkable, but bootleggers were clever. They hired chemists, sometimes called alky-cucus, to try and re-nurture the alcohol, removing the poisonous additives. This was incredibly dangerous. Sometimes they succeeded, but other times they failed, and the results were tragic. Thousands of people were blinded, paralyzed, or even killed by by drinking improperly treated industrial alcohol. It was a deadly cat-and-mouse game between the government and the criminal underworld. Finally, there was the personal use loophole. While you couldn't make beer or wine for sale, the act was a bit fuzzy on what you could do at home for your own consumption. An early draft of the bill allowed for the home brewing of non-intoxicating cider and fruit juices. This was widely interpreted as a green light for making wine and hard cider at home. Grape growers in California, who thought Prohibition would ruin them, actually saw their business boom. They started selling grape bricks, compressed blocks of dried grape concentrate with a very specific warning label. It would say something like, "Caution. After dissolving this brick in a gallon of water, do not place the liquid in a dark cupboard for 21 days, as it will turn into wine." It was a complete farce, a wink and a nod to the public. You could buy all the supplies you needed to make your own booze legally, as long as you didn't admit that's what you were doing. So, to sum it up, the Volstead Act made it illegal to manufacture, sell, or transport alcohol. But it did not make it illegal to drink it or own it if you bought it before the ban. And with loopholes for medicine, religion, industry, and home production, the law was less of an iron wall and more of a leaky dam. It didn't stop people from drinking. It just changed how, where, and what they drank. Instead of creating a sober utopia, it inadvertently created the perfect conditions for the rise of organized crime, speakeasies, and the generation of Americans who learned to view the law with cynical disrespect. In our next chapter, we'll explore exactly how that happened, as we dive into the world of the bootleggers, the rum runners, and the crime syndicates that Prohibition built. It's a story you won't want to miss. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next part of our journey through this fascinating era of American history. See you next time. The clock ticks. Louder now, each second a hammer blow, counting down the final moments of an era. The year is 1919. The day, January 16th. Across the United States, in every city, every town, a collective breath is being held. Tomorrow, the country will wake up dry. The 18th Amendment, the great social experiment known as Prohibition, is about to become the law of the land. But tonight, America is drinking. It's a farewell party on a national scale. In the glitzy ballrooms of New York's finest hotels, champagne fountains flow like never before. The jazz is frantic, the dancing more frenzied. There's a desperate energy in the air, a sense of last chance. People are ordering bottles, not glasses, trying to cram a lifetime of toasts into a few precious hours. They're drinking to the past, to the good old days they fear are gone forever. Further downtown, in the smoky backrooms of neighborhood saloons, the mood is more somber. Here, among the working men, the immigrants, the everyday folks, the bar is more than just a place to drink. It's a community center, a political forum, a refuge. Tonight, they share stories, they grumble, they raise their glasses of beer and whiskey with a defiant gloom. They're not just mourning the loss of a drink, they're mourning the loss of a way of life. They look at the familiar face behind the bar, the man who knows their name, their troubles, their triumphs, and they wonder, what will become of him? What will become of us? Even in the most respectable homes, decanters are being emptied. Wine cellars that have been carefully curated for generations are being raided. People who might normally have a single glass with dinner are pouring with a reckless abandon. They call them Last Supper parties. It's a strange mix of celebration and wake. They laugh, they sing, but underneath it all, there's a current of anxiety. What will this new, sober America look like? Meanwhile, in other quarters, there's a different kind of anticipation. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, the Anti-Saloon League, the tireless crusaders who fought for this moment for decades, are gathered in churches and meeting halls. They are not drinking, they are praying. They are singing hymns of victory. For them, midnight marks not an end, but a glorious beginning. The dawn of a purer, more righteous nation. They believe they have slain the great demon, drink, and that tomorrow will bring an age of prosperity, domestic peace, and moral uplift. The end of poverty, the end of crime, the end of broken homes, all promised with the banishment of the bottle. But there's a third group, watching and waiting in the shadows. The gangsters, the bootleggers, the opportunists. They aren't mourning the end of legal alcohol. They're rubbing their hands in glee at the birth of an illegal empire. They see the demand, the unquenchable thirst of a nation, and they see the opportunity to supply it at a premium. They are stockpiling, making deals, laying the groundwork for a network of speakeasies and smuggling routes that will soon crisscross the country. For them, Prohibition isn't a moral crusade. It's the business opportunity of a lifetime. The battle lines for the Roaring Twenties are being drawn tonight. Back in the saloons, the bartenders make their final calls. Last drinks. Folks, drink up. The words hang in the air, heavy with finality. Patrons chug their last beers, drain their last shots. Some even buy whole barrels, planning to roll them home through the dark streets. In one famous New York hotel, the staff ceremoniously drapes the bar in black crepe, as if it were a coffin. In San Francisco, a restaurant owner stages a mock funeral for a bottle of whiskey, complete with a tiny casket and mourners. The final minute arrives. The laughter quiets, the frantic energy subsides, replaced by a tense, expectant silence. In Times Square, a crowd gathers, not for New Year's, but for this strange, unprecedented countdown. 10 seconds. 9. 8. People look at each other. Strangers united in this surreal moment. 5. 4. 3. A final sip is taken. Two. 1. January 17th, 1920. America is officially, legally, a dry nation. A quiet falls. For a moment, it seems like the temperance crusaders were right. A hush descends. But it's not the hush of peace. It's the quiet before the storm. It's the silence of a door slamming shut, and another, more secret door, creaking open. The speakeasy is about to be born. The jazz age is about to find its rebellious rhythm. The Roaring Twenties have just begun, and in the sudden, sober silence of midnight, the future is anyone's guess. The great experiment has started, and nobody, not the drinkers, not the crusaders, not the gangsters, truly knows what comes next. Welcome back to our journey through history. Today, we're diving into Chapter 11. Saloons close, speakeasies open. Imagine this. The year is 1920. The 18th Amendment has just been ratified, and with it, the entire United States officially goes dry. The Volstead Act makes it illegal to produce, sell, or transport intoxicating liquors. The era of Prohibition has begun. The old-time saloons, those rowdy, swinging-door establishments that were a cornerstone of American social life, are forced to shut their doors for good. The government's goal was noble in their eyes: to curb crime, reduce social problems, and improve the nation's health and hygiene. For a moment, it might have seemed like the temperance movement had won a decisive victory. The streets grew quieter, and the familiar sights and sounds of the corner tavern vanished. But did people simply stop drinking? Absolutely not. Human ingenuity, especially when it comes to having a good time, is a powerful force. As the lights went out in the legal saloons, a new kind of establishment began to flicker to life in the shadows. This is where our story truly begins. The closure of saloons didn't eliminate the demand for alcohol. It just drove it underground. And with that, the speakeasy was born. The name itself, speakeasy, whispers of secrecy. You had to speak easy, or quietly, about these places to avoid alerting the police or federal agents. They were the complete opposite of the conspicuous saloons. While saloons had been loud, boisterous, and almost exclusively male domains, speakeasies were often sophisticated, secretive, and, for the first time in a big way, welcomed women. This social shift was revolutionary. The new woman of the 1920s, with her bobbed hair and rising hemline, was not only voting but also sipping cocktails right alongside the men. Speakeasies became the clandestine heart of the Roaring Twenties, fueling the jazz age with illicit booze and a spirit of rebellion. Finding one, however, was an adventure in itself. They were hidden in plain sight, tucked away behind the most mundane of facades. So, How did you get into one of these hidden dens? First, you had to know where to look. A speakeasy could be anywhere. It might be in the back room of a legitimate business, like a soda shop, a barber shop, or even a funeral home. Imagine walking into a florist to buy a bouquet, but instead of leaving with flowers, you whisper a secret phrase and are led through a false wall into a bustling, jazz-filled bar. Some were located in the basements of apartment buildings, in repurposed warehouses, or in the upper floors of seemingly ordinary brownstones. The exterior gave no clues. There were no signs, no bright lights, nothing to suggest the lively party happening just a few feet away. The only giveaway might be a discreet, sliding peephole in a heavy, unmarked door. This was your first test. You couldn't just knock. You had to know the secret knock, a specific rhythm that signaled you were a friend, not a foe. Once you gave the correct knock, a small slot would slide open, and a pair of eyes would peer out. This was the doorman, or the bouncer, and his job was to vet everyone. He'd ask for the password. Passwords changed constantly to keep ahead of law enforcement. One week, it might be Gus is sick. The next, it could be the eagle flies at midnight. If you didn't know the password, the peephole would slam shut, and you'd be left standing on the street. But if you whispered the correct phrase, you'd hear the satisfying clunk of a heavy bolt being drawn back. The door would creak open just enough for you to slip inside, and then it would be quickly shut and locked behind you. Stepping through that door was like entering another world. The quiet, ordinary street would be replaced by a cacophony of laughter, clinking glasses, and the vibrant sounds of a live jazz band. The air, thick with cigarette smoke, would be buzzing with an energy of shared defiance. Inside, the variety of speakeasies was astounding. They ranged from grimy, low-class joints known as blind pigs and cellars, serving questionable, homemade moonshine, to the most glamorous and opulent clubs imaginable. The high-end establishments were the stuff of legend. Think lavish decor, with plush velvet seating, polished wood bars, crystal chandeliers, and patrons dressed in their finest evening wear. In places like New York's famous 21 Club, the owners went to extraordinary lengths to hide their operations. The 21 Club had a system of levers that, when pulled, would cause the shelves of the bar to tilt, sending all the liquor bottles sliding down a chute into the city's sewer system. The bar would then instantly transform into a normal-looking counter. By the time federal agents broke down the door, there would be no evidence of illegal activity. Another famous spot, the Store Club, had multiple hidden exits and a complex alarm system to give patrons and staff ample warning to disappear during a raid. And what were they drinking? Certainly not the carefully crafted, aged spirits you might find today. The alcohol served in speakeasies was often crudely made and dangerously potent. Smuggled liquor, known as bootleg, came from Canada, Mexico, and the Caribbean, often brought in by notorious gangsters like Al Capone, but much of it was locally produced, moonshine or bathtub gin. This gin was literally made by mixing industrial-grade alcohol with water and flavorings like juniper oil in a bathtub. The results could be harsh, and sometimes even deadly if the distillation process wasn't done correctly. To mask the terrible taste of this homemade hoach, bartenders became incredibly creative. This is the era that gave birth to the cocktail as we know it. Drinks like the bee's knees, with lemon and honey, or the French 75, with champagne, were invented not just for flavor, but to make the rough spirits palatable. The cocktail became an art form born out of necessity. The rise of the speakeasy also fundamentally changed the social fabric of America. It brought together people from all walks of life. In these secret bars, you could find gangsters rubbing elbows with politicians, flappers dancing with factory workers, and artists debating with business tycoons. The shared risk of breaking the law created a unique sense of camaraderie. It was a great equalizer. Moreover, speakeasies was central to the explosion of jazz music. Many establishments hired black musicians, giving artists like Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington a platform and an audience they might not have found otherwise. The speakeasy became a cultural melting pot, a place where new ideas, new music, and new social norms could flourish, all under the nose of the law. It was an era of paradoxes, a time of government-imposed morality and widespread, joyful lawlessness. Of course, this entire system was built on a foundation of crime. The immense profits from bootlegging fueled the rise of organized crime syndicates. Gangsters like Al Capone in Chicago and Lucky Luciano in New York became incredibly powerful, controlling vast empires of illegal liquor distribution. They bribed police officers, judges, and politicians to turn a blind eye. Raids did happen, but they were often just for show. A speakeasy might get shut down one night, only to reopen a few days later after a few palms were greased. The constant cat-and-mouse game between the feds and the bootleggers became a defining feature of the decade. For the average person, a raid was part of the thrill. The sudden cry of police would send patrons scrambling for hidden exits, a story they could tell their friends the next day. It was all part of the daring, rebellious spirit of the age. By the early 1930s, it was becoming clear that Prohibition was a failed experiment. It hadn't stopped people from drinking. It had just made criminals rich and turned millions of ordinary citizens into lawbreakers. The government was also losing out on billions of dollars in tax revenue from alcohol sales, money that was desperately needed as the Great Depression took hold. Public opinion had turned decisively against the 18th Amendment. The fun and glamour of the speakeasy had worn thin for many, replaced by a desire for safe, legal alcohol, and an end to the rampant crime that Prohibition had spawned. The secret passwords and hidden doors were no longer a thrilling novelty but a tiresome obstacle. The nation was thirsty for a change, and so, in 1933, the 21st Amendment was passed, repealing Prohibition. The speakeasies, born of secrecy and rebellion, began to fade away as legal bars and taverns reopened their doors. Some of the most famous ones, like the 21 Club, successfully transitioned into legitimate, high-end restaurants and bars, and a few still operate today. Their walls filled with stories from a bygone era. The speakeasy era lasted just 13 years, but its impact was profound. It reshaped American social life, popularized cocktails, fueled the jazz age, and inadvertently created the modern organized crime syndicate. It was a fascinating chapter where, in response to the closing of saloon doors, a million secret doors opened, leading to a world of hidden glamour, danger, and defiance. It proves that when you try to legislate morality, culture will always find a way to push back. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this glimpse into the past, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more chapters of our history series. See you next time. Hello and welcome back to our series on Prohibition. Last time, we talked about the rise of the temperance movement and how the 18th Amendment came to be. But when one door closes, another, often illegal, one opens. Today, we're diving headfirst into the shadowy world of Chapter 12. Bootleggers and rum runners. These weren't just characters in old movies. They were the masterminds of a massive, clandestine industry that kept America wet during its driest years. So, the country goes dry in 1920. Did people just stop drinking? Of course not. Demand for alcohol didn't disappear. It just went underground. And where there's demand, there will always be a supply. This created the perfect storm for a new kind of entrepreneur to emerge. The bootlegger. The term bootlegger actually dates back to the 1880s, referring to smugglers who would hide flasks of liquor in their boot tops. But during Prohibition, bootlegging exploded from a small-time hustle into a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. Let's start with the supply lines. America is a huge country with thousands of miles of borders and coastlines, making it a smuggler's paradise. To the north you hug Canada. The Canadian government didn't have Prohibition, and many provinces were more than happy to legally produce and export liquor. The border became a sieve. Smugglers, known as rum runners, would drive cars loaded with Canadian whiskey across frozen rivers in the winter. These cars were often modified for speed and stealth, with souped-up engines and hidden compartments. The Detroit River, separating Michigan from Ontario, became one of the busiest smuggling routes in the world. They called it the Detroit-Windsor Funnel, and it's estimated that a staggering 75% of all illegal liquor entering the U.S. came through this one channel. Boats of all sizes, from tiny rowboats to powerful speedboats, would make the dangerous crossing under the cover of darkness, dodging Coast Guard patrols in a constant cat-and-mouse game. Now let's head south to the warm waters of the Caribbean. Off the Atlantic coast, a fleet of larger ships would anchor just outside the U.S. maritime limit, which was initially 3 miles. This line of ships became famously known as Rum Row. They were essentially floating liquor stores, stocked with high-quality rum from the Bahamas and other islands. From rum row, smaller, faster boats called contact boats would zip out to meet them, load up with cases of booze, and then make a mad dash for the shore, landing on secluded beaches from Florida all the way up to Maine. These captains were incredibly skilled sailors, navigating treacherous waters at night with no lights to avoid detection. The risks were immense. They faced not only the law, but also hijackers, or alquicucurs, who would try to steal their precious cargo. To combat this, Congress eventually extended the maritime limit to 12 miles, but the rum runners just adapted, using faster boats and more sophisticated tactics. It wasn't just about smuggling from other countries, though. A huge amount of illegal alcohol was produced right here at home. This is where the classic image of the backwoods still comes from. All across the country, especially in rural areas like Appalachia, people began distilling their own spirits. This homemade whiskey was often called moonshine, because it was typically made by the light of the moon to avoid the prying eyes of federal agents or revenuers. Making moonshine was a dangerous art. If done improperly, the resulting alcohol could contain methanol, a toxic substance that could cause blindness or even death. The quality varied wildly, from smooth, potent spirits to gut-wrenching rot gut that was barely drinkable. Despite the risks, homemade stills supplied countless speakeasies and individuals, forming the backbone of the domestic bootlegging market. In the cities, the production was a bit different. Instead of large outdoor stills, you had smaller operations in basements, warehouses, and hidden rooms. Industrial alcohol, which was legal for things like perfume and manufacturing, became a key ingredient. Bootleggers would denature it, a process of removing the added poisons to make it drinkable again. This was incredibly hazardous, and many people got sick from improperly processed alcohol. They would then water it down, add coloring and flavorings, and pour it into bottles with fake labels from famous brands like Gordon's Gin or Johnny Walker. You might think you were buying a bottle of fine imported scotch, but in reality, you were drinking reprocessed industrial alcohol from a bathtub in a Chicago tenement. This deception was part of the game. The logistics of this operation were staggering. Once the alcohol was smuggled in or distilled, it had to be distributed. This is where organized crime truly took hold. Gangsters like Al Capone in Chicago and Meyer Lansky in New York built vast empires by controlling the entire supply chain, from importation and production to transportation and sales. They used fleets of trucks, bribed police officers and politicians, and employed armies of enforcers to protect their turf. The innocent-looking flower shop on the corner might have a secret cold room filled with beer kegs, and the local funeral parlor might be using its hearses to transport cases of gin instead of casket. It was an entire parallel economy, operating in the shadows of legitimate society. The bootleggers and rum runners were a diverse group. Some were hardened criminals, but many were ordinary people just trying to make a living in difficult times. Farmers, fishermen, out-of-work factory employees. They all saw an opportunity to earn more money in one night of rum running than they could in a month of honest labor. People like Bill McCoy became legends. He was a famous rum runner who operated on Rum Row and was known for never watering down his liquor. His products were so reliable that the term the real McCoy came to mean the genuine high-quality article. He, and others like him, became folk heroes in a way, defying a law that a huge portion of the population viewed as unjust and hypocritical. So, from the frozen rivers of the north to the warm currents of the Caribbean, and from the mountain hollers to the city basements, a massive illegal network rose up to quench America's thirst. Bootleggers and rum runners weren't just breaking the law, they were fundamentally reshaping American society, fueling the rise of organized crime, and creating legends that persist to this day. They were the engine of the Roaring Twenties, and their story is a testament to the simple economic principle of supply and demand. Next time, we'll step inside the secret establishments they supplied. We're going to explore the glitz, glamour, and danger of the speakeasies. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. Welcome back to our series on the Roaring Twenties. Today, we're diving into Chapter 13, Gangsters' Rise to Power. It was an era of flappers, jazz, and economic boom, but beneath the glittering surface, a darker world was taking shape. The year is 1920, and the 18th Amendment has just been ratified, ushering in the era of Prohibition. The intention was noble, to curb the social ills associated with alcohol. But the reality? It created one of the greatest business opportunities in American history, not for legitimate entrepreneurs, but for a new breed of criminal. This nationwide ban on the production, importation, transportation, and sale of alcoholic beverages didn't just stop people from drinking. Instead, it drove the entire industry underground, creating a black market worth billions. And where there's that much money to be made, violence and ambition are never far behind. This is the story of how Prohibition, a law meant to purify the nation, ironically gave birth to organized crime as we know it today. It's a tale of speakeasies, hidden in plain sight, of rum runners braving the open seas, and of street corner thugs who would become kings of vast criminal empires. So, grab a seat, because we're about to explore how a well-intentioned law paved a golden road for gangsters, catapulting figures like Al Capone from obscurity into legendary infamy. Before Prohibition, crime in America was mostly local and disorganized. You had street gangs, small-time crooks, and neighborhood rackets. But the sheer scale of the illegal liquor business required something more. It demanded sophisticated networks for production, smuggling, distribution, and protection. Suddenly, criminal gangs had a common, incredibly lucrative goal. They began to cooperate, consolidate, and organize. Ethnic gangs, which had previously fought over turf, started forming powerful syndicates. The Irish, the Italians, the Jewish mobstay, all saw the potential. They carved up cities, established supply chains, and set up illicit breweries and distilleries. They weren't just selling booze. They were building corporations, complete with hierarchies, logistics, and ruthless enforcement. The public's thirst for alcohol was unquenchable, and these new criminal organizations were more than happy to supply it. Secret bars, known as speakeasies, popped up everywhere. You'd find them in basements, behind fake storefronts, even in upscale apartment buildings. Getting in required a password or a special knock. Inside, the party was always going. Patrons from all walks of life, from factory workers to high society elites, mingled and drank illegal hoch. It created a strange paradox. Breaking the law became a national pastime. This widespread defiance created a culture of corruption that reached the highest levels. Police officers, judges, and politicians were often on the payroll of these gangsters, turning a blind eye to the illegal operations in exchange for a cut of the profits. This systemic corruption was the grease that kept the wheels of the bootlegging machine turning smoothly. Now, let's talk about the man whose name is synonymous with this era. Al Capone. Born in Brooklyn to Italian immigrants, Alphonse Capone was a long way from the streets of New York. When he made his name, he got his start in the criminal underworld there, working for mobster Frankie Yale and earning his infamous nickname, Scarface, after getting slashed in a bar fight. But his destiny lay in Chicago. In the early 1920s, he moved to the Windy City to work for Johnny Torrio, the head of a burgeoning crime syndicate. Torrio was a visionary, a man who saw the potential of uniting Chicago's various gangs to control the bootlegging trade. Capone was his ambitious and brutal protege. When Torrio was nearly killed in an assassination attempt and decided to retire, he handed the reins of his empire to the 26-year-old Capone. What happened next was unprecedented. Capone took Torrio's vision and amplified it. He was a master organizer and a ruthless businessman. He consolidated control over speakeasies, breweries, and distilleries, using violence and intimidation to eliminate his rivals. His organization was incredibly sophisticated. They had fleets of trucks, warehouses, and a private army of gunmen to protect their operations. Capone wasn't just a thug. He was a CEO. He cultivated a public image, presenting himself as a modern-day Robin Hood, a businessman simply providing a service the public demanded. He opened soup kitchens during the Depression and was often seen at public events, always impeccably dressed. This friendly public persona masked a terrifying reality. The competition for control of Chicago's liquor trade was fierce, leading to bloody gang wars. The most infamous of these was the conflict between Capone's South Side Gang and the North Side Gang, led by his rival Dion O'Banion, and later Bug Zamarin. The streets of Chicago became a battlefield. Drive-by shootings with Thompson submachine guns, nicknamed Chicago typewriters, became horrifyingly common. The violence reached its peak on February 14, 1929, a day that would go down in history as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. On that morning, 7 members of Bugs Moran's North Side gang were gathered in a garage. 4 men, 2 of them dressed as police officers, entered the building. The North Siders, assuming it was a routine police raid, lined up against the wall, but it wasn't a raid. The assassins opened fire with machine guns, riddling the men with bullets. The killers then walked out calmly. The sheer brutality of the act shocked the nation. Bugs Moran, the intended target, had been running late and escaped the slaughter, but his gang was shattered. While Capone was conveniently in Florida and never officially linked to the massacre, everyone knew who was responsible. It cemented his reputation as the undisputed king of Chicago's underworld. The public, which had once been amused by his antics, now saw the terrifying violence that underpinned his empire. Capone's operation was estimated to be making him around $100 million a year, an astronomical sum at the time. He seemed untouchable. He had law enforcement in his pocket, and witnesses were too terrified to testify against him. Local authorities couldn't pin any serious crimes on him. But the federal government had another idea. If they couldn't get him for murder or bootlegging, they would get him for something else entirely. A quiet, determined Treasury agent named Elliot Ness and his team of incorruptible officers, nicknamed the Untouchables, began relentlessly targeting Capone's brewing operations, disrupting his cash flow. But the real breakthrough came from a different angle. His finances. The government began meticulously building a case against Capone not for his violent crimes, but for tax evasion. For all his millions, Capone had never filed a federal income tax return. He conducted all his business in cash and kept no records, thinking it would make him invulnerable. But federal prosecutors painstakingly tracked his extravagant spending and income through hidden ledgers and informant testimony. In 1931, Al Capone was finally indicted, tried, and found guilty of tax evasion. He was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, first in Atlanta, and then in the newly opened maximum security prison on Alcatraz Island. His reign was over. Stripped of his power and influence, his health declined, and by the time he was released, he was a shadow of his former self. The fall of Al Capone marked a turning point, but it didn't end organized crime. In fact, it forced it to evolve. Other gangsters, like Charles Lucky Luciano in New York, learned from Capone's mistakes. Luciano saw that the constant, high-profile violence was bad for business. He orchestrated the formation of the Commission, a national crime syndicate where the heads of the major crime families would meet to settle disputes, divide territories, and set policy, operating more like a corporate board of directors. They moved into other rackets, like gambling, loan sharking, and labor unions, diversifying their portfolios so they weren't solely reliant on one illegal enterprise. This new, more discreet form of organized crime was less flamboyant than Capone's, but far more resilient and enduring. The era of the Prohibition gangster, with its Tommy guns and flashy suits, came to an end with the repeal of the 18th Amendment in 1933. The government finally admitted that the noble experiment had been a colossal failure. It had not only failed to stop people from drinking, but it also empowered a generation of violent criminals, corrupted public institutions, and cost the government billions in lost tax revenue. The rise of gangsters like Al Capone is a powerful lesson in unintended consequences. It shows how a law, created with good intentions, can have disastrous effects when it goes against the will of the people. It created an environment where crime not only paid, but paid spectacularly well, leaving a legacy of organized crime that would persist for decades to come. Thank you so much for watching. This chapter of American history is a dramatic reminder of the complex interplay between law, society, and the shadowy figures who operate outside of it. If you found this journey into the world of Prohibition-era gangsters fascinating, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. Let us know in the comments which historical figure or event you'd like us to cover next. We'll see you in the next video. Hello and welcome back to our series, exploring the hidden chapters of history. Today, we delve into Chapter 14, Violence in the Shadows. This is the story of how the nationwide ban on alcohol, intended to create a more moral and orderly society, instead unleashed a tidal wave of crime and corruption that reshaped America's underworld forever. Before the 1920s, crime was mostly a local affair. Small-time crooks, neighborhood gangs, but nothing on the scale of what was to come. Then, overnight, the 18th Amendment made one of the nation's most popular products illegal. The demand didn't vanish, it just went underground. And where there's demand, someone will always find a way to supply it. This created a golden opportunity, a multi-billion-dollar black market, ripe for the taking. Enter the new breed of criminal, the organized bootlegger. Figures like Al Capone in Chicago, Lucky Luciano in New York, and the Purple Gang in Detroit saw the potential. They weren't just thugs. They were entrepreneurs of a dark and violent industry. They built empires from the ground up, with complex supply chains, secret breweries, fleets of delivery trucks, and armies of enforcers. They were organized, ruthless, and incredibly wealthy. The quiet streets of America's cities became battlegrounds. Rival gangs fought bloody turf wars for control of the lucrative bootlegging territories. Imagine a quiet Tuesday morning suddenly shattered by the roar of a Thompson submachine gun, a weapon that became infamously known as the Chicago typewriter. Drive-by shootings, once unheard of, became a terrifyingly common tactic. Gangsters didn't just fight each other. They eliminated competition with brutal efficiency. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929 is the most infamous example. 7 men from a rival gang were lined up against a wall and gunned down in a Chicago garage. A shocking act of violence that stunned the nation and exposed the sheer brutality of these gangland wars. This wasn't just about street-level violence. The corruption ran deep, reaching into the very institutions meant to uphold the law. The profits from illegal alcohol were so immense, the gangs could afford to buy silence and cooperation. Police officers, judges, and politicians were put on the payroll. A friendly officer might look the other way as a convoy of whiskey-laden trucks rolled through his district. A compromised judge could ensure that arrested gang members never saw the inside of a prison cell. This systemic corruption eroded public trust and made it nearly impossible to combat the rising tide of organized crime. It created a two-tiered justice system, one for ordinary citizens and another for the powerful gangsters who seemed to operate above the law. The violence wasn't contained to the big cities, either. In the rural backwoods of Appalachia, moonshiners who had been brewing homemade whiskey for generations found themselves clashing with both federal agents, known as revenuers, and organized gangs trying to take over their operations. These conflicts were often personal and deadly, fought in the isolated hollers and mountains where law enforcement was scarce. Legendary standoffs and car chases involving souped-up rum-runner vehicles became part of American folklore, a testament to the high-stakes game being played out across the country. These very cars and drivers, skilled at outrunning the law, would later form the foundation of what we now know as NASCAR. The human cost of this era was staggering. Beyond the gangsters themselves, countless innocent bystanders were caught in the crossfire. Small business owners were extorted for protection money. Families were torn apart. The promise of easy money lured many young men into a life of crime from which there was often no escape. The violence wasn't just a headline in a newspaper. It was a palpable fear that permeated daily life in many communities. Furthermore, the nature of the product itself became a source of danger. With no government regulation or quality control, the illegal alcohol market was a gamble. Some bootleggers cut their products with industrial alcohol, toxic chemicals, and other dangerous substances to stretch their supply and maximize profits. This rot-gut liquor could cause paralysis, blindness, and even death. Thousands of people suffered from poisoning after drinking contaminated booze, a tragic and often overlooked consequence of the underground trade. The era of Prohibition and its associated violence fundamentally changed America. It led to the rise of sophisticated, nationally connected criminal organizations, the likes of which had never been seen before. It demonstrated how a law, even with the best intentions, could have devastating and unforeseen consequences. The shadows that fell over the nation during this time were long and dark, filled with the echoes of gunfire and the quiet corrosion of corruption. When Prohibition was finally repealed in 1933, the criminal empires it created didn't just disappear. They adapted, moving into other illegal ventures, their structures and methods forever woven into the fabric of American crime. This chapter serves as a powerful reminder of the complex relationship between law, society, and human nature. The attempt to legislate morality didn't eliminate vice. It drove it into the shadows, where it grew more powerful, more organized, and infinitely more violent. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the violent world of the Prohibition era. If you found this chapter fascinating, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you do unmiss our next exploration into the hidden corners of history. See you next time. Welcome back to our series on Prohibition. Today, we're diving into Chapter 15. Law enforcement, overwhelmed. We often picture G-men in dramatic shootouts, but the reality for the average Prohibition agent was far less glamorous and much more frustrating. Let's uncover why the system was destined to fail from the very beginning. When the Volstead Act passed, the monumental task of enforcing it fell to the Prohibition Bureau. But here's the first major problem. They were given a tiny budget. Congress allocated only a few $1 million to police the entire nation, every city, every town, every mile of coastline and border. This meant the Bureau could only hire about 1,500 agents initially. To put that in perspective, that's one agent for every 70,000 people. New York City alone had thousands of speakeasies, far more than its handful of assigned agents could ever hope to handle. So, who were these agents? Well, they weren't the elite, highly trained officers we might imagine. The PE was shockingly low, about $1,600 a year. This was less than what many factory workers or even garbage collectors earned at the time. With such low pay and immense pressure, the job attracted a mixed bag of individuals. Some were genuinely dedicated idealists who believed in the cause of temperance. They saw it as a moral crusade to save the country from the evils of alcohol. But many others were simply desperate for a job, any job, and had little to no law enforcement experience. The screening process was minimal, and political appointments were common, meaning qualifications often took a back seat to connections. This combination of low pay, overwhelming workload, and lack of training created a perfect storm for corruption. For an underpaid agent, the temptation was enormous. A single bribe from a bootlegger could equal several months' salary. Why risk your life raiding a warehouse when you could just look the other way and make more money than you? D. Ever see? From your government paycheck. The bootlegging syndicates were flush with cash, and they used it strategically. They didn't just bribe patrolmen on the beat. They targeted everyone, from the agents on the ground all the way up to supervisors, police chiefs, and even politicians. This corruption became systemic. In some cities, the police force was practically on the payroll of organized crime. Officers would tip off speakeasies about upcoming raids, help transport illegal liquor in their patrol cars, or simply ignore blatant violations happening right under their noses. Honest agents who tried to do their job often found themselves isolated and undermined. They'd make an arrest, only to see the case mysteriously dropped, or the suspect released on a technicality, thanks to a corrupt judge or prosecutor. It was a deeply demoralizing environment. Imagine risking your life to bring down a major smuggling operation, only to see your efforts undone by a bribe. The sheer scale of the illegal alcohol trade made enforcement a logistical nightmare. Bootleggers were incredibly creative. They used everything from hidden compartments in cars and trucks to sophisticated smuggling vessels known as rum. These boats would anchor just outside U.S. territorial waters, in an area called Rumrow, and smaller. Faster boats would zip back and forth to the shore under the cover of darkness. The Coast Guard was just as underfunded and outmatched as the Prohibition Bureau. They were using aging ships to chase state-of-the-art speedboats, and they simply couldn't patrol the thousands of miles of coastline effectively. On land, the situation was no better. The border with Canada became a superhighway for smuggled liquor. Distilleries in Canada were legally producing whiskey and other spirits, which were then smuggled south in massive quantities. Agents patrolled these vast, remote borders, but they were vastly outnumbered. A few agents trying to cover hundreds of miles of wilderness were no match for organized smuggling rings, with fleets of vehicles and well-paid lookouts. Even when agents did manage to make a bust, the legal system was clogged. Courts were overwhelmed with Volstead Act violations. These cases ranged from major smuggling conspiracies to a person caught with a single bottle of homemade wine. The sheer volume meant that plea bargains became the norm. Major criminals often got off with small fines, which they treated as just another cost of doing business. The penalties were simply not a strong enough deterrent. For a bootlegging kingpin making millions, a $1,000 fine was a joke. Furthermore, public opinion was a huge factor in many parts of the country, especially in large urban centers. A significant portion of the population never supported Prohibition in the first place. They saw it as an unjust infringement on their personal freedom. This meant that local juries were often unwilling to convict their neighbors for something they didn't see as a real crime. An agent could present a mountain of evidence, but if the jury was sympathetic to the defendant, it didn't matter. This lack of public support eroded the legitimacy of the law and made the job of enforcement nearly impossible. The police were trying to enforce a law that a huge part of the population actively wanted to break. So you had a force of underpaid, undertrained, and often corrupt agents fighting against powerful, wealthy criminal organizations, with a clogged court system and a public that was either indifferent or openly hostile to the law. It's no wonder they were overwhelmed. The story of Prohibition enforcement isn't just a tale of crime and corruption. It's a classic example of what happens when a law is passed without the resources, the political will, or the public support to make it work. The system wasn't just weakened, it was set up for failure from day one, creating a chaotic and violent decade that would reshape America forever. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. Join us next time as we look at the rise of the iconic organized crime figures who built their empires on illegal booze. See you then. When the 18th Amendment passed, making the sale of alcohol illegal, you'd think that would be the end of it. America went dry. But did it really? Not even close. In fact, for many ordinary Americans, Prohibition wasn't an obstacle. It was an invitation to get creative. This wasn't just about gangsters and speakeasies. This was about your doctor, your pastor, and even your grandmother finding ways around the law. Let's start with the doctors. Suddenly, physicians all over the country discovered the amazing medicinal properties of alcohol. Whiskey for a cold, brandy for a weak heart. Absolutely. The law allowed doctors to write prescriptions for medicinal liquor, which could be filled at a pharmacy. And boy, did they write them. It became one of the biggest loopholes in the entire system. You could walk into a doctor's office, complain of just about anything from anxiety to a toothache, and walk out with a prescription for a pint of whiskey. Some doctors made a fortune just from writing these scripts. It's estimated that doctors prescribed millions of gallons of liquor every year during Prohibition. The government tried to crack down, limiting how many prescriptions a doctor could write, but it was like trying to plug 1,000 tiny holes in a dam. Then you have the religious exemptions. The law also permitted the production and use of wine for sacramental purposes. Churches and synagogues were allowed to obtain wine for their services. You can probably guess what happened next. Suddenly, there was a massive spike in the number of people identifying as priests, ministers, and rabbis. Congregations swelled overnight. One man in California, calling himself a bishop, started his own church and ordered enormous quantities of wine for his supposed flock of thousands. Authorities became suspicious when they realized his church was just a small storefront and his followers were just customers with a membership card. The sacramental wine loophole became a huge source of illegal booze, distributed through fake religious organizations. It was a holy mess and a very profitable one for those willing to bend the rules. But the real heart of the resistance was in the American home. This is where Prohibition truly failed. The law made it illegal to manufacture, sell, or transport alcohol, but it didn't explicitly outlaw the possession or consumption of it in your own home. And for wine, it even allowed families to make up to 200 gallons a year for personal use. This led to a massive boom in home winemaking. Grape growers in California, who initially thought they'd be ruined by Prohibition, found a new market. They started selling grape bricks, compressed blocks of grape concentrate. These bricks came with a very specific and very funny warning label. It would say something like, "Warning. After dissolving this brick in a gallon of water, do not place the liquid in a cool, dark place for 21 days, as it will turn into wine." It was a giant wink and a nod to the public, basically providing a recipe while pretending to warn against it. And it wasn't just wine. People started brewing beer in their basements and bathtubs. It was often called bathtub gin or homebrew. The quality was, let's just say, inconsistent. Sometimes it was fine, other times it was downright dangerous. But people were determined. Hardware stores started selling malt syrup, yeast, and everything else you needed to become a home brewer. The sales of these ingredients skyrocketed. It became a national hobby. Cookbooks from the era even included subtle instructions. A recipe might call for cereal beverage, a common euphemism for beer. For those who wanted something stronger, the home still became a common sight. People were distilling their own spirits from anything they could get their hands on: corn, potatoes, even fruit. This was far more dangerous than making wine or beer. A poorly made still could explode, and improperly distilled alcohol could contain methanol, which can cause blindness or even death. Newspapers were full of stories about these tragic accidents. But still, the demand was so high that people were willing to take the risk. It was a quiet, domestic rebellion happening in kitchens and basements all across the country. So you see, the idea that America was a dry nation during Prohibition is a myth. It was more like a damp nation, and in many places, it was as wet as ever. The law was so full of holes and so widely disrespected that it created a nation of casual lawbreakers. From doctors and clergy to ordinary housewives and husbands, a significant portion of the population was actively involved in either making, prescribing, or distributing alcohol. This widespread defiance wasn't just about a desire to drink. It was a statement. It was a rejection of what many saw as an unjust and un-American law interfering with their personal lives. The government simply couldn't police the private choices of millions of citizens. This grassroots rebellion, happening in households across the nation, was one of the biggest reasons why, eventually, the noble experiment of Prohibition had to come to an end. It showed that when a law is out of step with the people will always find a way around it. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe for more hidden stories from history. Hey everyone, and welcome back to our deep dive into history. Today, we're tackling a fascinating and chaotic chapter of the American story: Prohibition. Imagine a time when the entire country decided to ban the sale, production, and transport of alcohol. It was called the Noble Experiment, born from a genuine desire to curb drunkenness, reduce crime, and strengthen families. The intentions were good, but the reality was a whole different story. What actually happened when America went dry was a cascade of unintended consequences that reshaped the nation in ways no one could have predicted. So, let's start with the most famous consequence: the explosive rise of organized crime. Before Prohibition, gangsters were mostly small-time thugs involved in local rackets, but the 18th Amendment handed them a golden ticket. Suddenly, an entire industry, the alcohol trade, was illegal. This created a massive untapped market with millions of thirsty customers. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does business. Who stepped in to fill this void? Figures like Al Capone in Chicago and Lucky Luciano in New York. They weren't just street criminals anymore. They became CEOs of sophisticated criminal empires. They built complex networks for smuggling, called bootlegging, and for illegal production. They operated secret bars, known as speakeasies, which popped up in basements and backrooms across every city. To protect their turf, these gangs engaged in brutal warfare. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929 is a chilling example, where Capone's men, disguised as police, gunned down 7 rivals in broad daylight. The very law, designed to reduce crime, had inadvertently created a new, more violent, and far more organized form of it. Law enforcement was overwhelmed, and corruption became rampant as police officers, judges, and politicians were bribed to look the other way. But the danger wasn't just from gangsters, Tommy guns. It was also in the glass. With legal breweries and distilleries shut down, where did all this illegal booze come from? Much of it was homemade, and that's where things got really risky. People started concocting their own spirits and makeshift stills, often in their bathtubs, leading to the term bathtub gin. The problem was, these amateur distillers had no idea what they were doing. They often used ingredients like industrial alcohol, which contained deadly poisons like methanol. This rot-gut alcohol could cause paralysis, blindness, and even death. Thousands of people died from alcohol poisoning during Prohibition. It was a cruel irony. The movement that aimed to make America safer was literally poisoning its citizens. Even smuggled alcohol wasn't always safe. To stretch their supply, bootleggers would dilute imported spirits with water and sometimes add dangerous chemicals to give it a kick. You never knew what you were getting in a speakeasy. So while the goal was to improve public health, Prohibition created a public health crisis of a different kind. Now, let's talk about the money. Before Prohibition, taxes on alcohol were a huge source of income for the federal, state, and local governments. In fact, in some years, Alcohol taxes accounted for up to 40% of the federal government's revenue. When the 18th Amendment passed, that firehose of cash was shut off almost overnight. Poof. Gone. At the same time, the government had to spend a fortune trying to enforce this new, wildly unpopular law. They had to fund the Prohibition Bureau, hire more police, and pay for costly court cases and prisons. So, you have a double whammy. A massive loss of revenue combined with a massive increase in spending. This put a huge strain on government budgets, and who is making all the money that the government was losing? The gangsters, of course. Al Capone was rumored to be making the equivalent of over $1 billion a year in today's money, and none of it was being taxed. When the Great Depression hit in 1929, the economic argument for repealing Prohibition became overwhelming. The country was broke, and the idea of re-legalizing alcohol to generate tax revenue and create jobs in the brewing and distilling industries started to look very, very appealing. Beyond crime and economics, Prohibition also changed American culture. It created a generation that viewed breaking the law as a casual, almost glamorous activity. Speakeasies became cultural hotspots, places where people from different social classes mingled. It was also in these hidden bars that social norms began to shift. For the first time, it became socially acceptable for women to drink in public alongside men, a major change from the pre-Prohibition era. This defiance of the law fostered a widespread disrespect for authority that lingered long after the 21st Amendment finally repealed Prohibition in 1933. Noble experiment taught a hard lesson. Yuko, unjust, legislate morality. When a law is deeply out of step with what a large portion of the population wants, people will find a way around it. Instead of creating a more orderly society, Prohibition fostered a culture of lawlessness, danger, and corruption. So, when we look back, the story of Prohibition is a cautionary tale. It shows how a well-intentioned policy can backfire in spectacular fashion, creating problems far worse than the one it was trying to solve. It fueled the rise of organized crime, endangered public health with poisonous moonshine, and crippled government finances, all while failing to stop people from drinking. The era of speakeasies, flappers, and gangsters might seem romantic in movies, but the reality was a dark and turbulent period in American history, driven by the unintended consequences of a grand, but ultimately failed, experiment. Thanks for watching, and if you found this interesting, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into the past. See you next time. Welcome back to our series on Prohibition. Today, we're diving into Chapter 18. The public turns against the ban. By the mid-1920s, the grand social experiment of Prohibition was showing some serious cracks. The initial optimism that had ushered in the 18th Amendment was beginning to fade, replaced by a growing sense of disillusionment and skepticism across the nation. What started as a noble cause was now being questioned by the very people it was meant to protect. One of the biggest issues was the sheer difficulty of enforcement. The United States has thousands of miles of coastline and land borders, making it a smuggler's paradise. From the rum runners of the East Coast to the bootleggers crossing from Canada and Mexico, illegal alcohol flowed into the country like a relentless tide. Federal agencies like the Prohibition Bureau were woefully understaffed and underfunded. They were tasked with policing an entire nation of thirsty citizens. An impossible job from the start. Agents were often overworked, underpaid, and constantly tempted by bribes from wealthy crime syndicates. Corruption became rampant, not just among lowly officers, but reaching into police departments, courts, and even political offices. People saw this hypocrisy and began to wonder, if the law was so easily broken and the enforcers so easily corrupted, what was the point? This created a massive cultural shift. Before Prohibition, drinking was common, but the speakeasy culture that emerged was something entirely new. These secret bars, hidden behind unmarked doors and operating in defiance of the law, became symbols of glamour and rebellion. They were frequented by men and women from all walks of life, from college students to socialites to working-class folks. This widespread, open defiance of the law was a stark contrast to the pre-Prohibition era. It normalized low-breaking on a national scale. Suddenly, millions of otherwise law-abiding citizens were now criminals simply for wanting a drink. This created a profound disrespect for the law itself. People reasoned that if this one law was so foolish and unenforceable, perhaps other laws were too. This erosion of respect for legal authority was a dangerous side effect that many of the original supporters of Prohibition had never anticipated. Then there was the rise of organized crime. Prohibition didn't eliminate the demand for alcohol. It just handed the entire multi-billion-dollar industry over to criminals. Gangsters like Al Capone in Chicago and Lucky Luciano in New York built vast empires based on bootlegging, speakeasies, and bribery. The violence that accompanied their turf wars was shocking. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929, where 7 men from a rival gang were gunned down in a Chicago garage, became a horrifying symbol of Prohibition-era lawlessness. The public was horrified. They had been promised a safer, more moral society. Instead, their cities were turning into battlegrounds for mobsters. Newspapers were filled with stories of shootouts and assassinations, and many Americans started to feel that the cure of Prohibition was far worse than the disease of alcoholism it was meant to treat. The economic arguments also started to fall apart. Proponents of the ban had promised that money once spent on alcohol would now go towards consumer goods, boosting the economy. They also believed that sober workers would be more productive, but the reality was different. The government was losing a massive amount of tax revenue. Before Prohibition, taxes on alcohol were a significant source of federal income. Now, that money was gone, and instead, taxpayers were footing the bill for the costly and ineffective enforcement efforts. The closure of breweries, distilleries, and saloons also led to significant job losses, affecting everyone from brewers and bartenders to barrel makers and truck drivers. These economic realities became even more stark with the onset of the Great Depression in 1929. With millions out of work and the government desperate for revenue, the idea of relegalizing and taxing alcohol started to sound incredibly appealing. Public opinion began to shift dramatically. Organizations that had once championed the cause started to lose their influence. At the same time, new groups emerged advocating for repeal. One of the most influential was the Women's Organization for National Prohibition Reform, or WONPR. This was a game changer. Women had been the moral backbone of the temperance movement, arguing that alcohol destroyed families. But now, many of these same women were arguing that Prohibition was the real threat. They saw the corruption, the violence, and the way it was turning their children into lawbreakers by glamorizing illegal drinking. They argued that the best way to promote genuine temperance was through education and regulation, not an outright ban. Their involvement completely reshaped the debate. If the mothers and wives of America were turning against the ban, who was left to support it? By the late 1920s and early 1930s, the tide had fully turned. The issue became central to the 1932 presidential election. Franklin D. Roosevelt campaigned on a platform that included repealing the 18th Amendment. He argued that repeal would restore respect for the law, cripple organized crime, and provide a much-needed source of tax revenue to help fight the Depression. His opponent, the incumbent President Herbert Hoover, was seen as defending a failed policy. Roosevelt's landslide victory was a clear mandate from the American people. They had had enough. The journey from widespread support to widespread opposition was a complex one, driven by the stark realities of a policy that was failing on every front. The public saw that Prohibition didn't stop people from drinking. It just drove the practice underground and into the hands of violent criminals. It fostered a culture of corruption and disrespect for the law, all while costing the government a fortune. The dream of a sober, utopian America had dissolved into a nightmare of crime, corruption, and hypocrisy. The great experiment was over, and the public was ready to call it a failure. Thanks for watching. Join us next time as we explore the final chapter, the repeal of Prohibition and its lasting legacy on American society. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss it. Hey everyone, welcome back to our deep dive into the story of Prohibition. Today, in Chapter 19, we're talking about a massive, game-changing event, the Great Depression. It is a story of how a devastating economic collapse completely flipped the script on America's noble experiment. So, picture this. It's the Roaring '20s. The economy is booming, people are spending, and the government, at least on the surface, is championing the moral cause of Prohibition. They believed a sober America would be a more productive and virtuous America. The Anti-Saloon League and other dry organizations had spent decades convincing the nation that the evils of alcohol far outweighed any economic benefits it might bring. And for a while, with the economy soaring, it was an easy argument to make. Who needs liquor tax revenue when businesses are thriving and income taxes are flowing in? The moral high ground felt, well, affordable. But then, on October 29th, 1929, Black Tuesday, the stock market crashed and the world changed overnight. The Roaring Twenties came to a screeching halt, and the United States plunged into the Great Depression. Suddenly, the nation wasn't worried about moral purity anymore. It was worried about survival. As businesses failed and unemployment skyrocketed, a terrifying reality set in for the government. Its income was drying up fast. The personal and corporate income taxes that had propped up the federal budget were disappearing. President Herbert Hoover, a firm supporter of Prohibition, found himself in an impossible position. He needed money to fund the government and, ideally, to provide some form of relief to the millions of suffering Americans. But where was that money going to come from? This is where the conversation about alcohol starts to shift dramatically. Before the Depression, talking about bringing back liquor for tax revenue was seen as morally bankrupt. But now, with breadlines snaking around city blocks and families losing their homes, the argument started to sound a lot more like common sense. People began to look at the thriving black market for alcohol with new eyes. Al Capone and other gangsters weren't just selling booze. They were building empires, raking in hundreds of millions of dollars a year. And where was all that money going? Into their pockets, untaxed. It was an enormous, flowing river of cash, and the government wasn't getting a single drop. The irony was staggering. The government was spending a fortune, an estimated $300 million throughout the 1920s, trying to enforce a law that was not only failing, but was also creating a criminal underworld, richer than some legitimate industries. They were paying to stop people from doing something that could, if legalized and taxed, generate massive amounts of revenue. It was like paying a security guard to keep you out of your own gold mine. This economic desperation created a powerful new coalition for repeal. It wasn't just the waits who missed their beer. It was also hard-headed business leaders, economists, and everyday citizens who saw the absurdity of the situation. They started asking a very simple, powerful question. Why are we letting criminals get rich while the government goes broke and people starve? Prominent figures who had once been on the fence or even supported Prohibition began to change their tune. John D. Rockefeller, Jr., a lifelong teetotaler who had donated heavily to the Anti-Saloon League, publicly announced in 1932 that he now supported repeal. His reasoning was purely pragmatic. He argued that the illegal liquor trade was breeding widespread disrespect for the law, and crucially, that legalizing and taxing alcohol could provide a desperately needed financial lifeline. When a man like Rockefeller, a symbol of both wealth and Protestant morality, switched sides, people listened. The slogan of the repeal movement became incredibly effective. Vote wet for a dry treasury. It was a brilliant piece of political messaging. It framed the issue not as a moral debate about drinking, but as a practical solution to a national crisis. The argument was simple. Ending Prohibition would accomplish two critical goals at once. First, it would cripple the organized crime syndicates that had grown so powerful. Second, and more importantly for the average person, it would generate billions in tax revenue. This revenue, repeal advocates promised, could be used to fund public works projects, create jobs, and provide relief for the unemployed, all without raising income taxes on a population that had nothing left to give. The idea of a biotax paying for economic recovery was incredibly appealing. It felt like a win-win. As the Depression deepened, the moral arguments of the Dries began to sound hollow and out of touch. How could you lecture a man about the evils of a saloon when he could uneven afford to feed his family? The immediate, crushing reality of economic collapse made the abstract moral goals of Prohibition seem like a luxury the country could no longer afford. Priorities had changed. A steady job and a meal on the table were now far more important than the fight for national sobriety. The 1932 presidential election became a referendum on this very issue. Franklin D. Roosevelt ran on a platform that explicitly included the repeal of the 18th Amendment. He saw what Hoover perhaps did not, that the economic argument for repeal was now unstoppable. His victory was a landslide, a clear mandate from the American people not just for a New Deal, but for an end to the era of Prohibition. So, the Great Depression didn't just challenge Prohibition. It delivered the final, decisive blow. It transformed the debate from one of morality to one of pure economic necessity. The promise of tax revenue, The desire to bankrupt organized crime and the sheer desperation of a nation on its knees all converged to make repeal not just an option, but an urgent necessity. The quest for a sober nation was officially over, replaced by a much more desperate quest. The quest for economic survival. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe for our next and final chapter in this series. The year is 1932. America is caught in the suffocating grip of the Great Depression. Millions are jobless, homeless, and hungry. The nation's spirit is at an all-time low, and on top of all this economic misery, there's another source of widespread frustration. Prohibition. For over a decade, the 18th Amendment has banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages. What started as a noble experiment to improve society had backfired spectacularly. Instead of a sober, orderly nation, America got bootleggers, speakeasies, and a tidal wave of organized crime. Gangsters like Al Capone became household names, building empires on illegal liquor while ordinary citizens were criminalized for wanting a simple buyer. The law was widely disrespected, and the government was losing billions in potential tax revenue while spending a fortune on enforcement that clearly was unworking. This is the stage for one of the most pivotal presidential elections in American history. The incumbent, President Herbert Hoover, a Republican, is blamed by many for the economic collapse. He's seen as rigid and ineffective. He represents the old guard, the one that got America into this mess. On the other side is the charismatic Democratic governor of New York, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR. He comes from a wealthy, prominent family, but he has a unique ability to connect with the common person. Polio had left him unable to walk without assistance, a personal struggle that many believe gave him a deep empathy for those who were suffering. Roosevelt radiates confidence and optimism, promising a new deal for the American people. He's a symbol of hope and, most importantly, a symbol of change. As the 1932 election campaign heats up, one issue unexpectedly takes center stage alongside the economy: the repeal of Prohibition. The public is fed up. The anti-prohibition movement, once a fringe idea, has now gone mainstream. People aren't just thirsty for a drink. They're thirsty for jobs, for tax revenue, and for an end to the hypocrisy and crime that Prohibition has spawned. They see repealing the 18th Amendment as a common-sense solution to a whole host of problems. It would create jobs in breweries, distilleries, and restaurants. It would allow the government to tax alcohol sales, generating much-needed revenue to fund relief programs, and it would pull the rug out from under organized crime. The argument is simple and powerful. Why let gangsters get rich when the government could be using that money to help its people? The two candidates have very different approaches to this issue. President Hoover is stuck. He's a dry, meaning he personally supports Prohibition, but he sees the writing on the wall. His position is complicated and wishy-washy. He tries to find a middle ground, suggesting maybe states could decide for themselves. But this cautious, indecisive stance pleases no one. The dries think he's betraying the cause, and the weights, those who want repeal see him as just another out-of-touch politician, unwilling to make a real change. His hesitance makes him look weak at a time when America is crying out for strong leadership. Then comes FDR. Roosevelt is a masterful politician. He sees the shifting tides of public opinion and seizes the opportunity. At the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, he makes a bold and decisive move. He declares his outright support for the full and immediate repeal of the 18th Amendment. This isn't a maybe. It's not a compromise. It's a promise. He frames it not just as a social issue, but as a key part of his economic recovery plan. Repeal, he argues, is about jobs. It's about revenue. It's about restoring law and order. By tying the repeal of Prohibition directly to his New Deal promises for economic relief, he turns it into a major political weapon. His stance electrifies the country. For millions of Americans, FDR's call to end Prohibition is a symbol of his entire platform. If he's willing to take on this deeply entrenched, controversial law, then maybe. That's also the kind of leader who is bold enough to take on the Great Depression. He's opening Hoover. He's left looking like a relic of the past, clinging to a failed policy. The contrast couldn't be clearer. Hoover represents the grim, sober, and failing status quo. FDR represents a future of optimism, action, And yes, maybe even a legal buyer to take the edge off the hard times. The promise to end Prohibition becomes a rallying cry, a tangible piece of the change that Roosevelt is offering. When the election results come in, it's not even close. Franklin D. Roosevelt wins in a historic landslide. He carries 42 of the 48 states. It's a massive rejection of Hoover and the Republican Party, but it's also a powerful mandate for the New Deal and for the end of Prohibition. Roosevelt's victory is a clear signal that the American people are done with the old way of doing things. They are ready for bold experiments and decisive leadership, and one of the very first things on the agenda is to make good on that campaign promise. True to his word, shortly after taking office in 1933, Roosevelt moves quickly. Congress passes the 21st Amendment, which officially repeals the 18th. It's then sent to the states for ratification, and it passes in record time. By the end of the year, Prohibition is over. The era of speakeasies and bootleggers comes to an end, and Americans can legally buy a drink for the first time in 13 years. This swift and decisive action proves to the nation that FDR is a man of his word. It's an early victory for his new administration, building crucial momentum and public trust as he prepares to tackle the much larger beast of the Great Depression. The 1932 election wasn't just about the economy. It was about a fundamental shift in the American mood, and the fight to repeal Prohibition perfectly captured that desire for a fresh start, making it a defining issue that helped sweep Franklin D. Roosevelt into the White House and change the course of American history. Thanks for watching. If you found this dive into history interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about the pivotal moments that shaped our world. See you in the next video. Picture this: December 5th, 1933. A date that would go down in American history. Why? Because on this day, the United States did something it had never done before and has never done since. It repealed a constitutional amendment. We're talking about the end of Prohibition, the grand finale of one of America's most dramatic social experiments, all thanks to the 21st Amendment. Let's rewind a bit. For 13 long, and for many, very dry years, the 18th Amendment had banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages. This era, known as Prohibition, was supposed to usher in a new age of morality and public health. It was meant to reduce crime, solve social problems, and improve the nation's character. The reality, well, it was a little different. Instead of a sober utopia, America got speakeasies, bootleggers, and a massive surge in organized crime. Secret bars flourished in basements and back rooms, where people whispered passwords to get a taste of forbidden liquor. Figures like Al Capone became infamous, building criminal empires on the illegal booze trade. The very law designed to make America more law-abiding had, ironically, turned millions of ordinary citizens into lawbreakers. The government tried to enforce it. They really did. Federal agents smashed barrels and raided stills, but it was like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. The demand was just too high. People found ingenious ways to get their hands on alcohol. They distilled it at home, sometimes with dangerous results. Doctors prescribed medicinal whiskey. The whole thing became a bit of a national cat-and-mouse game. So what changed? Why did the country do a complete 180? A few big things. First, the Great Depression hit. In the early 1930s, the country was in economic ruin. Millions were out of work. The government was desperate for revenue, and guess what? Generates a lot of tax money. That's right, alcohol. The idea of legalizing, and therefore taxing, the liquor industry started to sound pretty good to a cash-strapped government. Second, public opinion had shifted dramatically. The noble experiment, as it was called, was widely seen as a failure. It hadn't stopped people from drinking. It had just driven the industry underground, making it more dangerous and profitable for criminals. The promise of a more orderly society hadn't materialized. Instead, the country was dealing with corruption and violence linked to the black market. The push for repeal was led by powerful groups and influential people. Organizations like the Association against the Prohibition Amendment argued that Prohibition infringed on personal liberty and was doing more harm than good. Even women, who had been a major force behind the original push for Prohibition, started to organize for its repeal, arguing it was creating a culture of disrespect for the law. The political tide turned with the 1932 presidential election. Franklin D. Roosevelt ran on a platform that included repealing the 18th Amendment. His victory was a clear signal that the American people were ready for a change. They wanted their jobs back, and many wanted their legal bagger back too. So, Congress got to work. In February 1933, they proposed the 21st Amendment. Its text is beautifully simple. Section 1 says, "The 18th Article of Amendment to the Constitution of the United States is hereby repealed." That's it. Short, sweet, and to the point. But to become law, it needed to be ratified, or approved, by 3/4 of the states. And here's another unique twist in the story. Instead of having state legislatures vote, the ratification process was done through special state conventions. This was a strategic move to bypass rural, pro-prohibition politicians and let the people's voice be heard more directly. Throughout 1933, state after state held its convention and voted in favor of repeal. The momentum was unstoppable. The final domino to fall was Utah. Yes, Utah. On December 5th, 1933, Utah became the 36th state to ratify the 21st Amendment, providing the necessary The moment the news broke, celebrations erupted across the country. In cities like New York, Chicago, and New Orleans, sirens blared. People flooded into the streets, cheering. Breweries that had been dormant for over a decade fired up their kettles. The famous Budweiser Clydesdales even made a symbolic trip to the White House to deliver a case of beer to President Roosevelt. It was more than just the return of legal drinking. It was a victory for personal freedom and a pragmatic response to a failed policy. The end of Prohibition meant the government could now tax alcohol sales, providing a much-needed financial boost during the Depression. It also took a massive source of revenue away from organized crime, helping to weaken their grip on American cities. The 21st Amendment remains a fascinating chapter in U.S. history for a few key reasons. It's the only time an amendment has been repealed, showing that the Constitution, while foundational, is a living document that can be corrected. It also highlights the power of public opinion to shape national policy. When a law is so widely disobeyed and unpopular, it simply can't be sustained. The story of Prohibition and its repeal is a powerful lesson about the limits of government power and the complex relationship between law, morality, and individual choice. It shows that trying to legislate morality can have unforeseen and often negative consequences. So, the next time you see someone enjoying a beer, a glass of wine, or a cocktail, remember the incredible journey it took to make that simple act legal. It's a story of social change, political maneuvering, and a nation deciding to admit it made a mistake and correct its course. The 21st Amendment isn't just about alcohol. It's about the very nature of American democracy. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this piece of history as interesting as I do, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that shaped our world. See you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our deep dive into one of America's most fascinating historical chapters. Today, we're exploring the final act, the morning after Prohibition. What happens when a nation wakes up from a 13-year-long nationwide social experiment? This is the story of the legacy of Prohibition and the profound lessons it taught America about law, morality, and human nature itself. The repeal of the 18th Amendment in 1933 wasn't just about legalizing alcohol again. It was a moment of national reckoning. For over a decade, the United States had tried to legislate morality, to use the full force of the government to ban a substance that was deeply woven into the social fabric of many cultures. The result? A catastrophic failure on almost every level. Crime didn't disappear. It became organized. Respect for the law didn't increase. It plummeted as ordinary citizens became lawbreakers overnight. The government didn't get richer from taxes. It lost a massive source of revenue and spent billions trying to enforce the So, what was the first major lesson? You can't simply outlaw demand. The desire for alcohol didn't vanish on January 17th, 1920. It just went underground. This created a colossal black market, a vacuum that was eagerly filled by savvy and ruthless entrepreneurs of crime. Figures like Al Capone in Chicago and Lucky Luciano in New York built vast empires on the sale of illegal booze. They weren't just street thugs. They were CEOs of sophisticated criminal enterprises with complex supply chains, distribution networks, and a brutal approach to market competition. The violence that erupted from the St. Valentine's Day Massacre to countless turf wars, wasn't just random chaos. It was business. And it was a business that flourished because the government had effectively handed them a monopoly. This leads to the second lesson. When laws are out of sync with public sentiment, they breed contempt for the law itself. Before Prohibition, most Americans might have seen the local police officer or federal agent as a figure of authority to be respected. But during the Prohibition era, that relationship soured. Millions of otherwise law-abiding citizens, your neighbor, your doctor, your local politician, regularly broke the law by visiting a speakeasy or buy-in from a bootlegger. The line between good citizen and criminal became incredibly blurred. This widespread disobedience eroded public trust in legal institutions. It taught a generation that laws could be arbitrary and that breaking them was unnecessarily a moral failing. The hypocrisy was rampant. Politicians who voted for the Volstead Act were often seen drinking in private clubs. This do as I say, not as I do attitude fostered a deep cynicism that lingered long after repeal. Another crucial takeaway is the immense difficulty of enforcing a law that a significant portion of the population doesn't support. The federal government created a special Prohibition Bureau, but it was perpetually underfunded, understaffed, and plagued by corruption. Agents were paid so little that taking bribes from wealthy bootleggers was an almost irresistible temptation. The sheer scale of the task was impossible. With thousands of miles of coastlines and land borders, stopping smugglers was a losing battle. And inside the country, illegal stills and breweries popped up everywhere. From rural barns to urban basements, the government was playing an unwinnable game of whack-a-mole. But perhaps the most profound lesson from Prohibition is about human nature. The noble experiment was born from a genuine, idealistic belief that society could be temperance movements, led by groups like the Anti-Saloon League and the Women's Christian Temperance Union, believed that alcohol was the root of all social evils, poverty, domestic abuse, and crime. They honestly thought that by eliminating alcohol, they could create a healthier, more virtuous nation. They saw it as a progressive reform, a step toward a better world. What they failed to account for was the complexity of human desire and the importance of personal liberty. People don't like being told what they can and cannot do, especially when it comes to personal consumption. The attempt to engineer a perfect society by removing a single vice not only failed, but it created a host of new, more dangerous ones. It concentrated power in the hands of criminals, corrupted law enforcement, and made a mockery of the legal system. The cure, as it turned out, was far worse than the disease. The end of Prohibition wasn't a victory for drinkers. It was a victory for pragmatism over naive idealism. When Franklin D. Roosevelt championed repeal, his reasoning was incredibly practical. He saw that legalizing and taxing alcohol would provide a desperately needed stream of revenue for a government grappling with the Great Depression. He saw it as a way to create jobs in breweries, distilleries, and restaurants. And he saw it as a way to strike a major blow against organized crime by taking away their primary source of income. It was a recognition that the government is often better at regulating and taxing human behavior than it is at banning it outright. The legacy of Prohibition is still with us today. It echoes in every debate we have about the role of government in our private lives. It informs our discussions on drug policy, gambling, and other vices. When people argue for the legalization and regulation of marijuana, for instance, they are often using the exact same arguments that were used to repeal Prohibition. It will generate tax revenue, reduce crime, and restore personal freedom. The ghost of Al Capone looms large over these debates, a constant reminder of what can happen when you create a lucrative black market. The era also left a cultural imprint. The speakeasy, the flapper, the jazz, these are all inextricably linked to the atmosphere of rebellion that Prohibition fought. It was a time of immense social change, and the fight over alcohol was a central part of it. It forced a national conversation about personal freedom, social responsibility, and the limits of government power. It taught us that morality is complex and can't be dictated from on high. What is considered a moral crusade by one group can be seen as an oppressive infringement on liberty by another. In the end, the nation woke up. On December 5th, 1933, a little wiser and a lot more sober about the realities of governing a diverse and complex society. The grand, utopian vision of a dry America had evaporated, leaving behind a legacy of unintended consequences. It taught us that good intentions aren't enough, and that when the law strays too far from the customs and desires of the people, it's the law that will ultimately break. The story of Prohibition is not just a story about alcohol. It's a timeless cautionary tale about the delicate balance between law, freedom, and the enduring, often messy, reality of human nature. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through one of America's most turbulent times. It is a period of history filled with lessons that are just as relevant today as they were a century ago. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next historical deep dive. We'll see you in the next video.